Tonight, we step into the cold, not the cozy candlelit kind, but the kind that kills engines, freezes blood, and decides who wins a war. In this story, winter isn't just a backdrop, it is a weapon. A force that chewed through armies and spat out ghosts. It turned rifles brittle, bred to stone, and men into silhouettes half buried in snow. From the silent forests of Finland to the endless white of the Eastern Front, the cold didn't take sides. It simply waited, patient and merciless. So pull your blanket tight and let the frost creep in just a little. This is the fascinating history of snowy warfare in World War II. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Pull your blanket closer, let your breathing slow, and let the sounds of the day fade into the distance. If you enjoy falling asleep to stories from history, consider subscribing for more, and if you'd like, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. It's always amazing to see this little community connected across time zones, sharing these quiet hours together. Now dim the lights, let the silence of winter settle around you. And let's begin. Imagine for a moment the world transformed by snow, not the gentle dusting that makes rooftops gleam, nor the soft flurries that drift lazily in the afternoon sun, but the deep, pervasive snow that blankets forests, fields, and roads in a silence so complete it feels as though the earth itself has paused. Each step crunches softly underfoot, the sound muted yet oddly precise, echoing faintly against the still, white landscape. The air is sharp, biting and alive, carrying the invisible weight of frost that seeps into clothes, into boots, into every exposed inch of skin. In the winter of war, snow is no mere backdrop. It is a presence, a patient, relentless adversary that waits silently for the unwary and the unprepared. War in snow is different from war anywhere else. Bullets fly, tanks rumble, and cannons roar. Yes, but there is another opponent that does not wear a uniform or answer to any general. The cold is impartial and unyielding. It does not care about rank, strategy, or supply lines. It creeps slowly beneath layers of clothing, settles into the folds of fabric, and gnaws at the extremities until even the hardiest soldier is reduced to a shivering, staggering figure. Frostbite arrives quietly, invisibly at first, then painfully, leaving fingers and toes numb, blackened, and useless. Breathing becomes laborious. The lungs burn with every intake of frigid air. The cold does not negotiate. It does not pause. It takes its toll while armies maneuver, while leaders plan, while men struggle to survive. Imagine a forest in November before the snow has fully settled. The first flakes drift down silently, brushing against evergreen needles, blanketing the uneven ground. Soldiers march through these early snows, boots crunching, breath misting, unaware that what they face is not only the enemy across the line, but the slow, creeping threat beneath every layer of wool and leather. Each step becomes heavier as the cold settles into the muscles, sapping strength, dulling reflexes, and clouding judgment. Snow is at once soft and lethal. It cushions a fall but hardens under the weight of frost, turning trails into treacherous traps, rivers into brittle glass over icy currents. In the theatre of winter warfare, the earth itself conspires with the cold, shaping the battlefield in ways no general can control. The stillness of snow hides danger. A frozen branch may snap under a soldier's weight, a thin layer of ice may betray his footing, or a snowdrift may conceal a hidden trench. Even in the absence of enemy fire, the cold creates casualties, men lost to hypothermia, frostbite, or the sheer exhaustion of moving through deep snow. Horses, machinery, and artillery suffer equally. Engines fail, lubricants freeze, metal contracts and cracks, and wheels sink helplessly into frozen mud. For every bullet fired, For every maneuver executed, the cold makes its silent claim. Winter, in this sense, is not a season, it is a general. It commands the battlefield with absolute authority, impartial, unforgiving, and omnipresent. There is a paradox to snowy warfare. The world is stunningly beautiful, even as it is deadly. Trees hang heavy with snow, the sunlight glints off crystalline fields, and the quiet is almost mesmerizing, as if time itself has paused. But behind the beauty lies a brutal truth. Survival depends not on courage alone, but on preparation, adaptability, and respect for the environment. Soldiers must learn to read the landscape, to sense hidden dangers beneath the snow, to conserve energy, to ration food, and to guard against the slow attrition of cold. Those who underestimate winter quickly learn the lesson, often too late. A single frostbitten hand can render a rifle useless. Frozen boots and numb feet can leave a man immobile, a target for both enemy and environment. Snow in war is deceptively serene, yet it can kill with precision and patience that surpasses even the most disciplined army. Consider the soundscape of a battlefield in snow. Unlike the thunder of guns and the clatter of tanks, winter muffles most noise. Footsteps crunch sharply, boots and skis cutting through the white carpet, but distant artillery seems muted, absorbed by the snow-laden earth. Explosions echo hollowly, dampened by frost and trees. In this quiet, sounds of human struggle are amplified. The hiss of heated breath, the snap of frozen wood, the scrape of metal on ice. Silence becomes another enemy. It betrays position, amplifies fear, and heightens the sense of isolation. To move unseen in the snow requires patience, skill, and an almost supernatural stillness, a lesson that armies in snowy climates learn quickly or suffer for dearly. Snow also shapes perception. Distances appear deceptive, flat plains stretch endlessly, hiding undulations and hazards beneath a uniform white. Shadows fall sharp and deep, contrasting with glaring snowfields, straining the eyes and forcing soldiers to navigate by instinct. Camouflage becomes both art and necessity. White clothing blends into the world, but even the slightest movement can betray a position. Visibility can vanish in minutes as a blizzard rises, swallowing paths, columns, and entire units. The same snow that aids concealment also threatens survival, reducing temperatures, impairing morale, and hiding the very ground needed for stability. Winter warfare is a dance of precision and humility, where human ingenuity must contend with the raw, overwhelming power of nature. Even logistics, the hidden backbone of any campaign, bends to the whims of winter. Supply lines that work in fair weather collapse in snow and ice. Roads disappear under drifts, rivers freeze unpredictably, and horses and vehicles move with agonizing slowness. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies become precious commodities. Delays mean frostbite, starvation, and despair. Commanders who do not respect the power of snow find themselves watching plans unravel as their soldiers struggle simply to survive the environment. In many cases, a frozen river or an impassable road proves more decisive than enemy tactics, shifting the balance of power without a single shot fired. Winter in warfare is also a test of human endurance and psychology. The cold isolates men, drives them into close quarters, and amplifies fear. Sleep is fitful, exhaustion is compounded by the cold, and morale swings like a pendulum. A soldier in snow fights not only the opposing army, but the slow erosion of spirit. Letters home speak of frostbitten limbs, the numbing loneliness of frozen forests, and the terror of silence. Stories of courage intermingle with tales of despair. Men who performed incredible feats to survive, others who succumbed quietly to frost, hunger, or the simple immensity of the cold. Snow turns each individual into a microcosm of war's cruelty, where survival demands constant vigilance and adaptability. Yet there is also a strange intimacy in snow. Armies learn to respect it, to rely on it, and to use it. Trenches are dug with awareness of how snow will settle, how blizzards can shield movements, how frozen rivers can carry troops unseen. Soldiers develop rituals to combat frostbite, conserve heat, and keep morale. Ski troops glide like ghosts across landscapes that would be impassable to conventional infantry. Engineers carve makeshift roads, sleds transport supplies over frozen lakes, and scouts become masters of winter observation. The snow is no longer merely an obstacle, it becomes a partner shaping tactics, strategy, and the very nature of warfare itself. As you picture these scenes, endless white forests, frozen plains, blizzards that erase all landmarks, soldiers moving silently, machinery groaning in ice, you begin to understand that in snowy warfare the most lethal enemy is often invisible. Frost bites where bullets cannot reach. Cold seeps into bones where artillery cannot. Winter does not choose sides, it does not negotiate, it does not relent. Yet it can be understood, respected, and with ingenuity and courage overcome. For a time at least. In these frozen landscapes, survival is an art. And so we leave the quiet world of snow hanging before the first blows of battle. The frost waits. The trees hold their breath. Soldiers tighten scarves, don gloves, and take their first steps into the white expanse, unaware of how this silent adversary will shape every gunshot, every movement, and every life. Winter is ready, patient, and unyielding. Soon, men will discover what it means to fight not only another army, but the cold itself. A foe that cannot surrender, be captured, or negotiated with. The world has turned white, and in that whiteness, history is about to unfold. And in the distance, just beyond the horizon, a small nation prepares to face an overwhelming power, Finland. The stage is set. The snow is ready, and the war of the winter begins. The year was 1939, and the chill of late November had settled across northern Europe with an almost unnatural thoroughness. The frost-stiffened trees coated roads with fragile ice and turned lakes into vast, deceptive sheets of glass. It was the kind of winter that made men reconsider the simple act of walking outside, let alone marching into battle. Yet in the forests and snowfields of Finland, a storm was about to break, not of wind or snow, but of human ambition and desperation. The Soviet Union, vast and seemingly unstoppable, had set its sights on its small neighbor. Joseph Stalin, confident and often paranoid, demanded territory and military bases as protection for Leningrad, just a few hundred kilometers south of the Finnish border. The Finns, a nation of fewer than 4 million people, rejected these demands. They valued their independence fiercely, carrying the memories of past wars and a deep connection to their rugged land. What followed on November 30th, 1939 was a calculated move that would test not only soldiers, but winter itself. The Red Army crossed the border. On paper, the situation was absurdly one-sided. The Soviets brought overwhelming numbers, hundreds of thousands of men, tens of thousands of tanks and artillery, and thousands of aircraft. The Finns could barely muster a fraction of this force. Their weaponry was modest, their tanks few, and their aircraft outdated. For every Finnish soldier, there were at least 3 Red Army troops facing them, and in some places far more. This was the classic story of David and Goliath, except David had to fight not only Goliath but also the frozen, unyielding northern winter. The first weeks of the Winter War were chaotic, a blur of snow and smoke. Soviet tanks moved down narrow, snow-choked roads, long columns stretching for miles, as if the enemy could be measured by distance alone. Soldiers marched in ill-fitting uniforms, thin coats barely sufficient for autumn, let alone the biting cold that dipped to 43 degrees Celsius on the coldest nights. Frost formed thick on eyelashes and beards, fingers stiffened, toes numbed, and the simplest task like striking a match, loading a rifle, or taking a bite of food became a monumental effort. Yet the Finns had a secret weapon, one that was not on any map or printed in any report: their deep knowledge of the land. Forests, lakes, and swamps became strategic allies. Every tree and hill was familiar, every frozen river a potential route or trap. Soldiers trained in these harsh conditions could move silently on skis, glide through forests with astonishing speed, and vanish into the snow as quickly as they appeared. They knew the snow's rhythms, the dangers beneath its surface, and how to turn the environment itself into a weapon. The Finnish troops were motivated by more than mere defense. They were fueled by sisu. The term carries no exact English equivalent, but it describes a unique blend of grit, courage, and unyielding determination. Sisu is the spirit of standing firm when retreat seems easier, of carrying on in the face of overwhelming odds, and of refusing to surrender to forces far larger and stronger. It is a quality that the Red Army could not measure or anticipate. It was, in essence, an invisible edge that the cold and the forest amplified rather than diminished. When Soviet forces attempted frontal assaults, they met not the easy resistance they had expected, but an entirely new form of combat. Finnish soldiers struck with precision and vanished like ghosts. They sabotaged supply lines, destroyed bridges, and attacked the flanks of lumbering columns that were easy prey in the narrow forest roads. The Red Army, trained for open plains and rapid maneuvers, struggled to adapt. Tanks sank into soft snow, vehicles became mired, and entire units found themselves isolated in the white wilderness. Exhaustion, fear, and frostbite took their toll alongside the Finnish bullets. One of the Finns' most effective strategies was the so-called motti tactic. The term, borrowed from logging, refers to cutting a long cord of firewood into manageable stacks. Militarily, it meant encircling and fragmenting the enemy column, breaking it into small, isolated pockets. Each trapped Soviet group became a self-contained target, vulnerable to attacks from multiple directions. Finnish forces would hit the front and rear simultaneously, then pick off isolated segments with deadly precision. Starvation and hypothermia became as lethal as any weapon. Soldiers trapped in a motti found themselves cut off from supplies and unable to move. Even the largest, most heavily armed divisions could be reduced to chaos by snow, cunning, and the quiet determination of a smaller force. The forests themselves became an arena of silent terror. Trees hung heavy with snow, concealing movement and muffling sound. The crunch of skis and snowshoes was the only noise, often enough to send shivers down the spines of Soviet soldiers who could hear but not locate their invisible adversaries. Night raids were particularly effective. Finnish soldiers, armed with submachine guns and grenades, struck and disappeared, leaving confusion and fear in their wake. This psychological aspect of the war was as important as any physical engagement. The fear of unseen enemies in an endless white expanse broke morale faster than any frontal assault could. Simo Heiha, later known as the White Death, became a symbol of Finnish resolve during these early weeks. A master sniper, he reportedly killed over 500 Soviet soldiers using simple iron sights, blending perfectly with the snow. To the Red Army, he was more than a man. He was a myth, a spectre in white that reminded them that in this land, familiarity with terrain and snow could outweigh sheer numbers. Every shot he fired was a reminder that victory in winter was as much about patience, cunning, and knowledge as it was about strength. At the WWII Road, the story of Finnish ingenuity and resolve reached its dramatic peak. Soviet columns, long and overconfident, moved into terrain they did not understand. The Finns struck with precision, cutting supply lines and isolating entire divisions. Tanks that should have been unstoppable became liabilities, frozen and immobile, easy targets for even minimal resistance. For days, the trapped soldiers were picked off systematically. Fires, gunfire, and desperation filled the forest, yet the snow remained indifferent. It blanketed the fallen and muffled the sounds of chaos, maintaining its serene, terrifying presence. The Soviets, despite their overwhelming numbers, were unable to break through this combination of landscape, cold, and Finnish skill. Supply shortages, mechanical failures, and frostbite compounded their losses. Each passing day deepened the chasm between expectation and reality. Leaders were confused, soldiers were terrified. The winter itself became a co-commander, impartial and ruthless. The Finns, meanwhile, were fueled by purpose, morale, and a sense that the land itself would aid them if they respected its dangers and opportunities. From the perspective of a Finnish soldier, the forest was a home, the snow an ally, and the invader a dangerous but ultimately surmountable problem. Every movement was calculated: when to advance, when to retreat, where to rest, and how to use the environment to amplify the effect of limited manpower. Survival meant mastering the cold, the snow, and the enemy's expectations simultaneously. It was a form of warfare that required more brains than brawn, more patience than brute force, and a willingness to endure discomfort that most men would consider unbearable. In these first weeks of the Winter War, the world saw something extraordinary: a small nation using intellect, terrain, and resolve to challenge a superpower. The forests and frozen lakes of Finland became both battlefield and weapon. Snow was not just ground to be walked upon, it was a participant in every skirmish, ambush, and retreat. It slowed, concealed, and punished. It reshaped strategy, disrupted logistics, and transformed ordinary soldiers into ghosts in white camouflage, able to move silently across a landscape that would have broken any other force. And as the frost deepened, the first fires of war flickered across the forests. Red Army columns struggled, tanks stalled, and the full scale of winter's challenge became apparent. Finland's resolve would be tested as never before, and the lessons of the snow-like patience, cunning, and respect for the environment would define the opening chapter of a conflict that the world was only beginning to witness. In the quiet, frozen nights when snow fell thick and silent, and the soldiers huddled against the cold, it was clear. This was not a war fought merely with rifles or artillery. This was a war where every man faced a dual enemy: the invading army and the vast indifferent winter itself. The forests, the lakes, and the snow-covered hills were waiting. And soon the Finnish defenders would turn those frozen landscapes into an unforgiving arena where even a giant like the Red Army could stumble and fall. From the edge of the forest, as moonlight shimmered on the untouched snow, the stage was set. Soldiers adjusted their scarves, checked their rifles, and tightened their boots. The cold had already begun its quiet assault, claiming warmth and patience in equal measure. And into this white crucible the Finns would step with skis, rifles, and an unshakable spirit. Ghosts in white, they were ready to show the world how small hands, guided by knowledge and courage, could shape the destiny of even the largest of invaders. The story of snowy warfare had begun in earnest, and the quiet, lethal forests of Finland were about to teach a lesson that armies and generals would never forget. Soon we will see how these soldiers became more than defenders, how they became ghosts on skis, masters of winter, and the living embodiment of a small nation's indomitable will. The forests of Finland in the dead of winter were a strange, otherworldly place. Snow clung to branches in heavy drifts, muffling every sound and softening the outlines of trees and boulders. A silence fell that was almost unnatural, broken only by the occasional groan of ice or the whisper of wind through the pines. To the untrained eye, the forest might have seemed empty, peaceful even. But for the soldiers of the Red Army, this silence was anything but comforting. They were walking into a nightmare they could not yet see, and the enemy was invisible. The Finnish soldiers had mastered this landscape in ways that went far beyond simple survival. They moved on skis, sliding effortlessly over snow that would have trapped the heaviest tanks and trudging soldiers of the Soviet columns. These skis were not luxury items but instruments of war. Each glide allowed them to strike quickly, to vanish just as suddenly, and to exploit the terrain in ways that were utterly alien to their invaders. Their movements were deliberate, precise, and ghostly, so quiet that even the closest observers often only saw the aftermath of an attack, a disoriented enemy, a toppled supply sled, or the faint trace of tracks in the snow. Camouflage was the linchpin of their strategy. The Finnish soldiers dressed in white from head to toe, blending perfectly with the snow-covered landscape. Faces were painted, rifles wrapped in cloth to reduce glint, and even packs and skis were muted in tone. This was not vanity. It was survival. In a world where the smallest movement could betray your position, visibility meant death. The Red Army had been trained for battle on open plains or urban streets, not in forests where the enemy could vanish as easily as smoke into the cold air. And vanish they did. Tactics were adapted to the forest and snow. Finnish ski troops rarely engaged in large-scale frontal assaults. Instead, they preferred ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and the destruction of supply lines. They struck from the flanks, from behind trees, and along frozen rivers that were invisible highways for those who knew the ice's secret weaknesses. The Soviets, with their long, cumbersome columns of men and vehicles, were trapped by their own expectations. They moved forward thinking in linear terms, unaware that the forest itself was a co-conspirator, bending their plans and turning their numbers into liabilities. At night, the forest transformed into something even more terrifying for the unprepared. Finnish patrols would move silently, using darkness and snow to conceal their presence. Fires were minimized to prevent detection. Signals were given with subtle gestures and barely audible sounds. When an attack came, it was sudden and brutal. A grenade thrown from a hidden ditch, a submachine gun spitting fire from the tree line, or a sniper's bullet from some unseen perch, all delivered a shock that left Soviet troops disoriented and panicked. The psychological effect was devastating. Men who had marched confidently during the day found themselves fearful and hesitant in the snowbound night, unsure if the next step would be met by enemy fire. The concept of the motti was central to these tactics. Columns of Red Army soldiers stretched thin along icy roads became the perfect prey. Finnish ski troops would split, striking the front and rear simultaneously, slicing the column into isolated pockets. Each motti was a self-contained trap, vulnerable to attrition, starvation, and the relentless cold. Finnish forces would pick off each segment methodically, destroying food supplies and targeting officers to maximize confusion. For soldiers encircled by snow and trees, the forest itself became a prison, and the Finns the wardens, merciful in appearance but lethal in practice. Simo Heiha, the infamous White Death, exemplified the terror these ghosts on skis inspired. Equipped with only iron sights and a rifle, Heiha moved through the forests with uncanny precision. To Soviet soldiers, he was a phantom, a figure that appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. Over the course of the Winter War, he is credited with over 500 confirmed kills, a testament not only to his skill, but also to the power of mastering winter warfare. His presence was a constant psychological threat, and he became the embodiment of the environment itself, a reminder that the snow and forest were allies to those who knew them intimately. Communication and coordination were crucial. Finnish patrols moved in small groups, each aware of the terrain and the enemy's likely positions. Signals were silent, rehearsed, and intuitive. A hand gesture, a glance, a slight movement of a ski pole could convey instructions across a distance where speaking would have been fatal. This fluidity allowed the Finns to conduct complex maneuvers that seemed almost choreographed, striking the Soviets from multiple directions in rapid succession. A single motti could be assaulted from 3 sides within minutes, leaving the trapped soldiers confused, exposed, and increasingly vulnerable to frostbite and exhaustion as well as bullets. Supplies were limited, and soldiers had to adapt to survive. Rations were simple, often dried or frozen, yet the Finns had learned how to make them stretch. Fires were used sparingly, smoke could give away positions. Warmth was found in movement, not in long rests. Sleep came in short bursts, often in snow shelters or behind tree lines. The Red Army, on the other hand, struggled with logistics. Their massive columns relied on long, vulnerable supply lines that the Finns could strike with devastating effect. Frozen engines, jammed vehicles, and the inability to bring in hot food or medical supplies compounded their misery. The forests were also excellent for snipers, ambushers, and scouts. Snow muffled sounds, but it also made tracks visible to those who knew how to read them. Finnish soldiers could follow an enemy's trail, anticipate movements, and set traps. Every tree, hillock, and frozen river became a potential advantage. Even small units could have an outsized impact because the environment multiplied their effectiveness. The Red Army, unfamiliar with this terrain, walked blindly into these traps, suffering both material and psychological losses. Winter itself was a partner in Finnish strategy. Temperatures plunged to extreme lows, and the snow, ice, and wind were as much an enemy as any human opponent. Soldiers who didn't respect the cold could be incapacitated or killed without a single shot being fired. The Finns had learned to move quickly, to layer clothing strategically, and to preserve body heat. Frostbite was always a risk, but careful movement, short periods of rest, and the use of fire in concealed locations mitigated its effects. The Red Army, unprepared and poorly equipped, paid dearly. Fingers froze, boots filled with ice, and morale collapsed as men realized that the cold could be as deadly as Finnish bullets. Despite their small numbers, Finnish forces created chaos among Soviet units. Morale plummeted, units became fragmented, and discipline broke down. Officers were isolated or eliminated, leaving soldiers leaderless in a foreign and brutal landscape. The snow-covered forest, once a quiet, neutral place, became a theater of asymmetric warfare where knowledge, patience, and mobility mattered more than sheer force. Every ambush, motti, and sniper kill reinforced the lesson that in winter warfare, numbers alone did not guarantee success. The psychological impact on Soviet soldiers cannot be overstated. The constant threat of hidden enemies, the soundless approach of skis over snow, and the impossibility of seeing the full battlefield wore them down over time. Exhaustion combined with fear and small mistakes could be fatal. Soldiers became wary of their own shadows, questioning every noise, every movement, and every patch of disturbed snow. The forest was no longer just a forest. It had become an extension of the Finnish army, an ally, invisible yet omnipresent. As the weeks passed, Finnish ghosts on skis continued their campaign. Roads were blocked, supply lines disrupted, and isolated units picked off one by one. The Red Army learned painful lessons about overconfidence, unfamiliar terrain, and the limits of brute force. A single misstep could mean capture, freezing, or death. For the Finns, each day of survival and each successful motti reinforced their mastery over both the enemy and the elements. The landscape itself had become a force multiplier, turning the small, resolute nation into a formidable adversary despite its limited resources. By the time winter had fully settled over Finland, the forest had earned a reputation of almost mythical lethality. Soviet soldiers whispered about white phantoms, invisible marksmen, and the deadly unpredictability of the Finnish army. The snow was no longer neutral. It had become part of the weaponry, part of the defense, and part of the terror. Each glide across the frozen landscape, each calculated ambush, and each motti dismantled the illusion that size and numbers guaranteed victory. The ghosts on skis were more than soldiers. They were a living manifestation of human ingenuity in harmony with nature. They showed the world that winter, often dismissed as an obstacle or inconvenience, could be harnessed as a powerful ally. And in the silence of the forest, with snowflakes drifting down and the wind whispering through pine needles, the Finnish army's mastery of snowy warfare became an example of how intellect, courage, and environmental understanding could redefine the rules of battle. In this frozen wilderness, the Red Army faced not just men, but a landscape animated by skill, strategy, and relentless determination. The snow itself became a weapon, the trees a shield, and the ski-clad soldiers' phantoms that haunted every column, every checkpoint, and every frozen road. The war in the forests of Finland had begun, and its lessons would resonate far beyond the boundaries of this small, snow-laden nation. From the treetops to the frozen rivers, the stage was set for the next phase of the Winter War. The Red Army would learn, painfully, that the ghosts on skis could not be outnumbered or intimidated. They could only be respected or defeated with great cost. And as the frost deepened and the nights grew longer, these spectral warriors would continue their silent, deadly dance through the snow, shaping history one ambush at a time. Soon, the true cost of winter on an unprepared army would become evident, as the Red Army froze, faltered, and faced the merciless arithmetic of snow and ice. The first signs of winter came subtly at first, almost teasing: a frost on the morning trees, a thin layer of ice on the shallow streams, snowflakes drifting lazily from a grey sky. But for the soldiers of the Red Army advancing into Finland in late 1939, these were warnings they neither fully understood nor heeded. They had crossed the border expecting an easy march, a demonstration of Soviet might against a small, stubborn neighbor. Instead, they were about to meet an enemy far colder and more unforgiving than any army: General Winter himself. Almost immediately, the effects of the cold were apparent. Engines in trucks and armored vehicles refused to start. Diesel thickened, lubricants froze, and batteries lost charge at an alarming rate. Vehicles became immobile, their tracks spinning uselessly in the soft snow or grinding against ice. Commanders tried to keep the columns moving, unaware that every delay, every stalled truck, was making them more vulnerable to the silent predators stalking the trees. To the Finns, this was a mercy. The snow and ice had become weapons as effective as any rifle or machine gun, neutralizing the Red Army's numerical advantage before a single bullet was fired. Men suffered even more acutely than machines. The Soviet soldiers were dressed for mild autumn weather, not the crushing cold that could dip below -40°C. Boots were thin, gloves inadequate, and coats more symbolic than practical. Hands froze into stiff, pale claws that made rifle handling precarious. Faces turned blue, noses dripped icicles, and lips cracked under the dry, biting air. Those who tried to warm themselves with small fires risked exposure, revealing their position to unseen foes. Even a brief stop for rest became a gamble against frostbite, hypothermia, or death. The forest itself seemed to conspire with the Finns, the snow-muffled movement creating a deceptive silence. Tracks in the snow told stories that the Red Army could neither read nor respond to efficiently. Finnish ski troops moved like whispers across the landscape, striking from the tree line, disappearing into the drifts, and leaving panic in their wake. Entire platoons would vanish in the night, only to be discovered the next morning, frozen disoriented, or captured. The Red Army's standard formations, designed for open plains, were ill-suited for the dense, snow-choked forests. What looked like power on a map became vulnerability in practice. As the days lengthened and the cold deepened, morale suffered catastrophically. Soldiers were exhausted from constant marching through deep snow, wet and cold to the bone. They were hungry, rations frozen or spoiled, and sleep came only fitfully on makeshift bedding that offered little warmth. Complaints rose, discipline faltered, and the ever-present threat of unseen Finnish snipers and ski patrols added a psychological weight heavier than any pack of equipment. Commanders, many inexperienced due to Stalin's purges, could not enforce the strict order necessary to maintain cohesion, and units fragmented under stress. Frostbite became rampant, fingers blackened, toes froze, and men were forced to amputate their own extremities or suffer permanent damage. Hypothermia crept silently, leaving the strongest and fittest men unable to think, move, or even call for help. Soldiers huddled together for warmth, bodies pressed against each other in frozen, uncomfortable positions, trying to preserve life in a landscape that gave no quarter. In some cases, soldiers simply collapsed, never to rise again, swallowed quietly by the snow that would become both grave and witness to the horrors of unprepared winter warfare. Beyond the physical, the cold wreaked havoc on the mind. Exhausted soldiers lost focus, misjudged distances, and stumbled into traps or hidden Finnish positions. Panic spread quickly when officers were targeted and taken down by sharpshooters. Units lost their coordination, moving blindly through the forest with little understanding of their surroundings. Radios failed, signals were misinterpreted, and the chaos multiplied with every passing day. In the snow, confusion became a weapon as lethal as any rifle. Even simple tasks became monumental. Building a fire was not simply a matter of gathering twigs. Wood was buried under snow, soaked through and difficult to ignite. Cooking food was a near impossible challenge, as flames had to be sheltered from biting wind. Water froze before it could be boiled, and yet the Finns thrived in this environment, moving lightly and efficiently, while the Soviets were slowed, trapped, and beaten down by the relentless cold. The winter was both enemy and equalizer, punishing arrogance and rewarding cunning. Supply lines crumbled under the strain. Trucks stuck in snowdrifts blocked roads, forcing men to carry heavy equipment over treacherous terrain. Ammunition ran low, food became scarce, and medical supplies were inadequate for the number of frostbite and hypothermia cases. Horses used to pull artillery and transport supplies suffered just as badly, often dying in the snow or collapsing under exhaustion. The logistical nightmare compounded combat losses, as soldiers were unable to advance effectively and became easy targets for Finnish guerrilla tactics. Communication across the front became nearly impossible. Commanders could not see or hear their subunits effectively. Reports lagged behind reality by hours, leaving decisions outdated before they could be acted upon. Misjudged terrain, unfamiliarity with snowdrifts, and the constant movement of Finnish forces meant that the Red Army rarely knew exactly where enemy troops might strike next. Each failed reconnaissance mission risked lives and wasted precious time, adding to the chaos already instilled by the cold. The environment was a silent executioner. Men suffered injuries simply by slipping on ice, falling through thin crusts of frozen lakes, or getting trapped in deep snowdrifts. Hypothermic soldiers were slow, clumsy, and easily captured. Even survival itself became a test of mental resilience, forcing men to confront the brutal reality that sometimes death came not from the enemy's bullets, but from the cold, wrapping itself around one's body with lethal patience. Vehicles and artillery became almost useless. NKs designed for speed on firm ground became immobilized in snowdrifts, their engines refusing to turn over in sub-zero temperatures. Guns jammed, mortars froze, and ammunition hardened. soldiers found themselves stranded in exposed positions, unable to maneuver or retaliate effectively. Finnish forces, knowing the weaknesses of the enemy machines, struck when the Red Army was most vulnerable, exploiting every mechanical failure to devastating effect. The psychological toll was intensified by isolation. Units became separated, often unable to contact one another. Men wandered alone in the forest, tracking the snow but losing bearings in the featureless white landscape. Fear of ambushes was constant, yet even when no human threat was present, the cold itself induced terror. Sleep-deprived, frostbitten and hungry, soldiers felt the winter pressing down like a living, conscious enemy, relentless and indifferent to pleas for mercy. The Winter War revealed the sheer cost of unpreparedness. Soviet soldiers who had marched confidently across the border found themselves trapped, freezing, and demoralized. Their enemy was no longer just the Finnish army. It was the frost seeping into every seam of clothing, the snow packing into boots and jamming rifles, the ice-laden wind biting unprotected skin. Each day was a test of endurance against both man and nature, and the Red Army paid the price in thousands of casualties without a single Finnish bullet fired in many cases. By mid-December, the toll of frost, hunger, and despair was staggering. Entire divisions were immobilized, their morale in tatters. Officers tried to rally men, but leadership had been decimated by snipers and Motti tactics. Exhaustion blurred the line between living and dying. Frostbite amputations became routine in field hospitals, and even those who survived were scarred for life. It was clear that the Winter War was not a contest of sheer numbers or firepower, but of adaptation, resilience, and mastery of the environment. The Red Army's failures in Finland were a harsh lesson in humility. Superior numbers and equipment were insufficient against a climate that had been weaponized by a smaller, better prepared force. The forest, snow, and ice, combined with the cunning and skill of Finnish troops, turned an overwhelming invasion into a disaster of colossal proportions. For those caught in the cold, every breath was a reminder of mortality, every frozen step a reminder that survival required both ingenuity and respect for the merciless winter. The stage was set for the Rat Road, where these failures would become tragically visible. Entire divisions, crippled by cold and misjudged terrain, would find themselves trapped and destroyed in a single, devastating sequence. The Red Army, despite its size and might, had underestimated the simple, relentless arithmetic of snow, ice, and human ingenuity. As the frost deepened and the soldiers struggled to survive, the forest and the winter prepared to exact their most brutal toll. The frozen landscape had taught a cruel lesson. In this war, bullets were only part of the danger. The cold could kill faster than any gun, and the forest could conceal both life and death in equal measure. The Red Army, mighty on paper, was humbled by the elements. Every stalled vehicle, frozen weapon, and frost-bitten hand was evidence that winter had become the deadliest general on the battlefield, invisible, impartial, and unrelenting. As the snow continued to fall and the nights grew longer, the Red Army's ordeal intensified. The freezing temperatures, combined with the tactical genius of the Finnish ski troops, created an environment where survival itself became an extraordinary act. Soldiers huddled in the drifts, trying to preserve warmth, while the forest waited silently, knowing the value of patience. The coming days on the Rati Road would be the grim culmination of these lessons, a test of whether men could endure both enemy and environment. And so, as frost crept into every boot and every uniform, and the snow absorbed the cries and footsteps of thousands, the Red Army faced a chilling reality. Victory would not come by force alone, but by learning to respect the unyielding power of winter. Soon, the full consequences of ignoring this silent adversary would unfold, and the frozen forests of Finland would witness a spectacle of destruction and survival that would echo far beyond the northern borders. The route road stretched like a white ribbon through the frozen forests of Finland, a narrow corridor carved into the snow that connected villages, outposts, and, tragically, the destinies of thousands of men. To the Soviets advancing down this road in December 1939, it appeared to be a straightforward route, a way to push deeper into Finnish territory and seize the momentum of their invasion. On paper, it was simple: 2 divisions, a corridor of snow, and a path to strategic victory. In reality, it would become a nightmarish corridor of death, where winter and human cunning combined to produce a tableau of horror that would echo for decades. From the moment the Red Army entered the route road, the Finns were waiting. They had watched, they had calculated, and they had prepared. Their approach was subtle. No grand armies lined the trees, no massive artillery opened fire. Instead, they used silence as a weapon. Snow-muffled footsteps, hidden branches created natural obstacles, and narrow stretches of the road allowed for precise, deadly ambushes. The Soviets, accustomed to commanding massive columns and relying on sheer numbers, found themselves confined, channelized into a path where every error could be fatal. The first attacks were sudden and almost imperceptible. A shot rang out, a crack from a sniper's rifle, precise and deadly. Officers fell first, as the Finns had learned that leadership was the weak link in any hierarchical army. Panic rippled down the long lines of Soviet soldiers. Confusion grew as men searched for the source, finding only empty forest and drifting snow. The Finns were ghosts, appearing and disappearing in moments, leaving devastation in their wake. Small Finnish detachments struck from the tree line, flanking the column and striking at the supply wagons. Horses bolted in terror, drivers froze in place, and vehicles became congested along the snow-bound road. The more the Soviets tried to push forward, the tighter the snare became. Finnish ski troops moved like shadows across the white landscape, executing the Motti tactic with deadly efficiency, isolating segments of the column, encircling them, and then cutting them off from support. The weather itself became a participant in the slaughter. Winds whipped across the road, stinging exposed skin and freezing the breath of soldiers before it even left their mouths. Snowdrifts concealed traps and slowed reinforcements. Every misstep could send a man tumbling into a deep drift, separated from his unit and vulnerable to both frost and Finnish marksmen. Hypothermia crept through the ranks silently, reducing men to shivering, disoriented figures, too weak to fight or retreat. The winter was impartial. It consumed Soviet troops with the same cold efficiency as the bullets that found their targets. Food and water were scarce, supply wagons had been destroyed or abandoned, and the men had to subsist on what little they carried. Frozen rations offered little nourishment, and melting snow for drinking water consumed precious energy and heat. Exhaustion mounted quickly. Men stumbled along the road, their boots sinking into snow, their hands numb, their bodies aching. Discipline faltered as fear and fatigue took hold, creating disorder that the Finns exploited mercilessly. The ambushes were relentless. Finnish forces attacked in waves, appearing where they were least expected. Soldiers thought they had found a temporary safe zone, only for the white-clad figures to descend upon them again. Artillery and mortars fired from hidden positions, while ski troops circled behind to sever retreat routes. Encircled pockets of Red Army soldiers, isolated, trapped and freezing, found themselves with nowhere to run. The Motti tactic transformed the road into a series of frozen islands of desperation, each one being methodically destroyed over days. Psychological terror compounded the physical suffering. Soldiers could hear the gunfire echoing through the forest, but the attackers themselves remained unseen. Officers shouted orders, trying to organize counterattacks, but communication was impossible. The terrain and the chaos fragmented units before any coherent response could form. Men huddled together for warmth, for courage, for the faint illusion of protection, but the Finns struck with precision and then vanished like the snow drifting into the trees. Fear became an additional enemy, as deadly as bullets or frostbite. By the time the Soviets realized the full scope of the trap, it was too late. Long columns of trucks, tanks, and men were immobilized. Vehicles clogged the road, their engines frozen, their wheels spinning uselessly in the snow. Horses and draft animals perished, leaving artillery stranded. Soldiers, trapped in frozen pockets, found themselves slowly succumbing to the elements. Some tried to dig foxholes, but the snow and ice made the effort almost impossible. Exhaustion and cold made movement clumsy, predictable, and ultimately fatal. One by one, the isolated motties were destroyed. The Finns struck supply lines first, knowing that a starving, freezing soldier was far less capable of resisting than a well-fed one. Ammunition was burned or seized, artillery pieces abandoned, and food stores destroyed. Each attack reduced morale further. The once formidable divisions of the Red Army had been reduced to scattered, terrified men trying simply to survive. By the time the fighting subsided, thousands lay dead or frozen, and the snow itself was stained with both blood and the toll of frostbite. The WWII Road massacre also revealed the limits of size and numbers. 3 Soviet divisions, tens of thousands of men, had been channeled into a narrow, snowbound corridor and dismantled by a force that was a fraction of their size. It was not the weight of weapons or the roar of artillery that won this battle. It was strategy, knowledge of terrain, adaptation to winter, and relentless execution. Every frozen hand, every snow-covered tree, every rifle muzzle concealed in white camouflage contributed to a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction. Casualty reports were staggering. By the end of the battle, the Soviets had suffered thousands of deaths, with an even greater number captured or incapacitated. Finnish losses, by contrast, were minimal, a few hundred at most. The stark contrast underscored the lesson of the Winter War. In the forest and snow, mobility, knowledge, and preparation outweighed sheer numbers. The road that had seemed a simple route into Finnish territory had become a trap of near-mythic lethality. Survivors described the aftermath with a mix of horror and disbelief. Entire columns of tanks and trucks were abandoned, burned out by Finnish forces or disabled by the frost. Bodies lay frozen in the snow, often so close together it was difficult to distinguish one from another. The silence after the attacks was eerie, broken only by the wind whipping across the empty road and the distant cracking of ice under the weight of the forest. It was a quiet, haunting testament to the deadly efficiency of the defenders and to the power of winter as a force multiplier. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. Snow-covered pines stood like silent witnesses to the carnage, their branches weighed down by white drifts, their shadows stretching long over the frozen ground. Tracks of fleeing soldiers, of ski patrols, and of retreating vehicles crisscrossed the snow, a chaotic map of destruction. The WWII Road had become more than a battlefield. It had become a testament to survival, ingenuity, and the merciless arithmetic of cold, terrain, and human will. For the Red Army, the massacre was a humiliation as well as a tragedy. It exposed the incompetence of leadership, the failure to adapt to winter conditions, and the vulnerability of a massive force when mobility, intelligence, and morale were underestimated. The losses at Rate Road reverberated throughout the Soviet ranks, a stark warning that size alone could not guarantee victory in a land dominated by ice and snow. Meanwhile, the Finns celebrated not with triumphal fanfare, but with quiet satisfaction. Their knowledge of the terrain, their ability to endure and exploit the cold, and their daring tactics had resulted in one of the most remarkable victories of the Winter War. The WWII Road had become a crucible, forging both strategy and legend. Stories of the battle would circulate for decades, not only as a testament to Finnish ingenuity, but as a lesson in the unforgiving nature of winter warfare. And yet, as the snow continued to fall, blanketing the road in white once more, there was no sense of finality. The war raged on, the Red Army would regroup, and the lessons of Rate Road would echo far beyond the forests of Finland. The Finnish victories had bought time, inflicted humiliation, and demonstrated the power of adaptation, but the relentless winter campaigns were only beginning, and the larger forces of global conflict loomed on the horizon. In the silence that followed the massacre, it was impossible not to notice the dual nature of the winter battlefield. It was both a killer and a shield, a graveyard and a protector. Soldiers lay frozen or shattered along the snowy road, yet the snow itself preserved them in stark, white tableau, a silent record of human endurance and error. Here, amidst the trees and drifts, the full cost of underestimating winter was writ large, each footprint a mark of ambition, fear, and survival. The Rate Road massacre was not just a battle, it was a chilling meditation on the intersection of man, machine, and the merciless environment. It revealed that even the largest and best-equipped armies could be reduced to rubble if they ignored the lessons whispered by frost and forest. And as the cold seeped into every crack of uniforms, every frozen rifle, and every exhausted soldier, the next phase of the winter war loomed. One where both sides would continue to test their limits against an enemy that could not be reasoned with, only endured. The snow on the Rate Road had settled again, blanketing the forest in a deceptive calm. The echoes of gunfire had long faded, leaving only the whisper of the wind through the pines and the faint crunch of frost underfoot. For the soldiers who survived, for the commanders who witnessed the devastation, and for the wider world observing these events from afar, the lessons of the Winter War were both immediate and profound. The Finns had demonstrated that sheer numbers were no guarantee of victory, that knowledge of terrain and climate could turn the tide, and that a small, determined force could humiliate the most powerful army in the world. In the icy air of Helsinki, in the smoke-filled corridors of Moscow, and even in the drawing rooms of Berlin, military strategists pored over reports and battlefield maps, attempting to digest the implications. The Red Army, despite its staggering losses and humiliating defeat, quickly recognized the mistakes that had cost so many lives. Poor preparation for winter, inadequate clothing, insufficient food and medical support, and a complete misunderstanding of the forested terrain were mistakes that could not be repeated. Officers took notes, manuals were rewritten, and new winter training programs were hastily instituted. Stalin, known for his ruthlessness, demanded explanations and purges, seeking to ensure that no repeat of the Rate Road massacre could occur under his watch. Hitler, watching from Berlin, absorbed a different lesson entirely. Unlike Stalin, he did not focus on the failures of leadership or preparation. Instead, he saw the Red Army's poor performance as confirmation of his deeply held belief in the inferiority of the Soviet system. If the Soviets, with all their numbers and resources, could be so easily humiliated by a smaller, better prepared force, then surely the German war machine could achieve even greater victories. In the icy forests of Finland, he saw not a warning, but a template for his ambitions. He imagined crossing the vast expanses of the Soviet Union with speed and precision, confident that his soldiers' training, discipline, and technological superiority would carry the day. The brutality of winter would be a challenge, yes, but one that could be overcome with proper planning, or so he believed. Meanwhile, Finland had learned the value of improvisation, ingenuity, and the human spirit. Soldiers returned to villages to recover, their boots crusted with ice, their faces weathered by frost and wind. Yet their morale remained unbroken. They had faced an enemy 10 times their size, and they had survived. They had used skis to move silently across the snow, camouflage to disappear into the landscape, and clever tactics to isolate and destroy enemy units. The lessons extended beyond military strategy. They were lessons about endurance, adaptation, and respect for the unforgiving elements. Elsewhere in Europe, observers took note of the Winter War with a mixture of awe and unease. Military analysts in Britain, France, and even neutral countries scrutinized maps and reports, fascinated by how a small nation had used its environment as a force multiplier. Journalists described the frozen forests, the trapped Soviet columns, and the ski soldiers moving like ghosts through the snow. The Route Road became a case study in asymmetrical warfare, in the interplay between man, machine, and climate. It was a vivid illustration of a principle that would repeat across the coming years. In northern winters, the cold itself could be as lethal as any army. For the Red Army, the human cost was staggering and the impact on morale severe. Survivors spoke of frozen bodies littering the snow, of comrades lost not to enemy fire, but to frostbite and exhaustion. Supplies had been destroyed, ammunition lost, and lines of communication severed by the simple cruelty of weather combined with Finnish tactics. The winter was not merely an obstacle, it was an active participant, punishing arrogance and rewarding skill and endurance. Leaders in Moscow recognized that in future conflicts, winter could not be underestimated, yet the lessons would be tested again in ways that none of them could have fully anticipated. And yet, while generals, politicians, and analysts debated strategies, the common soldier simply endured. Finnish troops celebrated in hushed tones, sharing stories of ambushes and narrow escapes over steaming bowls of thin soup. They spoke of their comrades who had fallen, of the horror of seeing entire Soviet units trapped and frozen, and of the quiet pride in having defended their homeland. For them, the snow was no longer just a backdrop. It was a participant, a teacher, and, in a sense, a comrade. They had learned to read it, to move with it, and to let it work on their side. Hitler's perspective, in contrast, was shaped by ideology and ambition. The Winter War had reinforced his preconceptions about the Soviet Union, that it was weak, disorganized, and ripe for conquest. He saw an opportunity that would not be repeated, and he planned accordingly. In secret chambers in Berlin, maps were unrolled, orders drafted, and Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, began to take shape. The lessons of Finland were distilled, but not in the way one might hope for accuracy. He took note of the Red Army's lack of winter preparation, but assumed that his own forces would be better equipped, better trained, and able to push through the Russian winter with the efficiency of a machine. He could not foresee the scale, the resilience of the Soviets, or the merciless severity of a winter that would make even the bravest soldier falter. For the rest of the world, the Winter War was a stark reminder of nature's power over human endeavor. Armies could be massive, tanks formidable, and artillery devastating, but frost, snow, and sub-zero winds could level the playing field, or tilt it decisively in favor of the prepared. The conflict highlighted a crucial truth about warfare in northern climates. Understanding and respecting the environment was as critical as any strategy or weapon. Nations began to reconsider their own readiness for winter campaigns, and military manuals were rewritten to emphasize cold weather training, insulated uniforms, and logistical planning for frozen roads and snowbound terrain. Yet even as planners and strategists absorbed these lessons, they did so with varying degrees of understanding. Some viewed winter as a challenge to overcome with discipline and planning. Others, like Hitler, saw it as an obstacle to be conquered by superior will and machinery. The contrast between these approaches would prove decisive in the coming years, as armies that underestimated winter would suffer catastrophic consequences, while those that respected its power would gain an almost supernatural advantage. The Winter War also revealed the human cost of miscalculation. Soldiers suffered from frostbite, exhaustion, and starvation, and these losses often exceeded those inflicted by bullets and artillery. The terrain punished mistakes, turning logistical errors into death sentences. Winter was impartial, indifferent to rank or nationality, and unyielding in its demands. The experiences of Finnish troops and their Soviet adversaries alike would shape military thought for decades, influencing tactics, equipment, and strategy. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the seeds of a much larger catastrophe were being planted. Hitler's confidence in his army's ability to succeed in the East, reinforced by the perceived weakness of the Soviet forces during the Winter War, would set the stage for Operation Barbarossa. He underestimated the scale of the Soviet Union, the resilience of its people, and the inevitability of Russian winter. The very environment that had aided the Finns would soon become a monumental challenge for the German army, a challenge for which they were woefully unprepared. The lessons of Rate Road, the frozen forests, and the cunning of the Finnish defenders were thus paradoxical. They were immediate, practical, and effective, but they were also filtered through ideology, ambition, and hubris. What one general saw as a warning, another saw as a blueprint. What one soldier experienced as terror, another interpreted as opportunity. The duality of understanding the power of winter would echo through the campaigns of 1941 and beyond, shaping strategy, human endurance, and the fate of millions. In the quiet aftermath, as snow continued to fall over the Finnish forests, one could almost hear the whisper of the future battles to come. Lessons had been learned, but they were fragile, subject to misinterpretation, and filtered through the lens of human arrogance. The stage was being set for a clash on a scale that dwarfed the Winter War, where frostbite, frozen vehicles, and sub-zero temperatures would once again turn the environment into a deadly, impartial opponent. The frozen lessons of Finland were clear. Preparation mattered, adaptation mattered, and respect for the winter's power could make the difference between life and death. Yet, the coming year would test these principles on a grander, more horrific scale. Soldiers and generals alike would learn anew the truth that winter does not forgive. And as the world prepared for the invasion of the East, one could feel the cold pressing forward like a silent army, ready to challenge the ambitions of men who had forgotten or chosen to ignore the quiet, lethal lessons of the Rate Road. June 22, 1941 dawned over Eastern Europe with a quiet that belied the storm about to be unleashed. At first light, over 3 million German soldiers began to move eastward, the largest invasion force in the history of mankind. Tanks rumbled across border crossings, trucks roared down narrow roads, and columns of infantry stretched for miles, their boots crunching over the early summer fields. This was Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's audacious plan to destroy the Soviet Union in a single, overwhelming stroke. Confidence was high, almost reckless. Years of blitzkrieg. Success in Western Europe had convinced the Wehrmacht that no army could withstand the precision, speed, and firepower of German forces. What could possibly stand in their way? As the soldiers marched, few paused to consider the scale of the land they were crossing. The Soviet Union was vast, a continent of forests, rivers, marshes, and endless expanses of steppe. It was one thing to storm across the comparatively compact terrains of France or Poland. It was something else entirely to attempt to conquer a land where the winter was a constant, omnipresent adversary and the supply lines stretched impossibly long. Yet this thought rarely crossed the minds of the soldiers trudging forward in the June heat, and it certainly did not temper the confidence of the high command. The early weeks of the invasion were spectacular, at least on paper. Panzer divisions carved deep into Soviet territory, encircling armies and capturing massive numbers of prisoners. Red Army units, often caught by surprise, crumbled under the precision of the German advance. For soldiers at the front, each day brought both exhilaration and exhaustion. They moved quickly, living off what the land provided, taking rations from captured depots and relying on their speed and training to stay ahead of the Soviet defenses. Villages were overrun, towns surrendered, and the vast distances between Moscow and the advancing Germans seemed to shrink with every calculated maneuver. But beneath the surface of these early successes, subtle cracks began to appear. The scale of the invasion was unprecedented. Roads became clogged with men, horses, trucks, and artillery. Bridges, rivers, and rail lines, critical for moving supplies, were quickly strained to their limits. Every mile deeper into Soviet territory extended the supply lines, leaving forward units dependent on fragile chains of logistics. Even the most meticulous planners could not anticipate the enormous distances involved, nor the impact of weather that would arrive far sooner than they expected. And then the first hints of winter began to make themselves known. While the early stages of Barbarossa were fought in summer, the calendar marched inexorably forward. Autumn would come, and with it the Rasputitsa, the infamous season of mud. The German generals, focused on blitzing to victory before the onset of frost, underestimated the sheer ferocity of the Russian climate and the resilience of its terrain. Roads that had been solid in June transformed into quagmires of clay and water as autumn rains fell. Horses, vehicles, and men sank into the mud. Columns that once moved with precision now creaked and groaned, immobilized in an ever-thickening soup of slush and ice. The human toll of this relentless advance began to mount. Soldiers suffered from fatigue and hunger. Tires and treads were shredded in the mud. Horses, essential for towing artillery and supplies, succumbed to exhaustion. Trucks and tanks became useless, swallowed by the ground. Yet the push eastward could not be stopped. Orders from Hitler were strict. Forward, forward, forward. Retreat was unthinkable, a concept unworthy of the Wehrmacht. Each soldier knew that to halt was to invite disaster, but forward often meant moving into zones where winter's hand would soon turn deadly. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was far from passive. While the initial onslaught had caught many units off guard, the Red Army was regrouping, drawing on reserves and reinforcements from the vast interior. Cities like Leningrad, Smolensk, and Kiev became centers of desperate defense and fierce counterattacks. Soviet engineers destroyed bridges, mined roads, and scorched the earth, denying the invaders critical resources. And behind every defensive line, the winter waited, patient and indifferent, ready to expose the arrogance of those who ignored it. In the weeks of the invasion, soldiers began to encounter the first brutal reminders that this was not a conventional campaign. The air became bitterly cold as autumn approached, and with it came the challenges of maintaining equipment and morale. Engines struggled with early frosts, lubricants thickened, and tanks bogged down in frozen fields. Men, accustomed to the temperate climates of Western Europe, found their clothing inadequate. Socks became wet and frozen, boots stiffened, and exposed skin developed frostnip and frostbite. Small problems compounded into critical failures as the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into unfamiliar, unforgiving territory. The landscape itself seemed to conspire against the invaders. Vast forests offered cover to Soviet snipers and small ambush units. Rivers slowed movement and became natural choke points. Open plains exposed men and vehicles to artillery fire and aerial attacks. And all the while, the clock ticked toward winter, a season the German High Command had promised themselves they would not see in full force at the front. Each day, the sun set earlier, temperatures dipped further, and the inevitability of frost became impossible to ignore. For soldiers on the ground, the human cost of the invasion was immediate and visceral. Exhaustion, hunger, and fear were constant companions. Units that had been organized and disciplined at the beginning of June began to fray under the pressures of distance, terrain, and an enemy that refused to be decisively destroyed. Letters home described frozen rivers, muddy roads, and the crushing loneliness of advancing into an endless, snowbound expanse. The morale of men who had once believed in swift victory began to waver, though few dared to speak openly. Behind the scenes, logistical officers worked feverishly to keep supplies flowing. Convoys pushed forward through crowded, crumbling roads. Warehouses emptied at an alarming rate, and troops often had to live off captured food, which was irregular, insufficient, and sometimes dangerous. Ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies lagged behind the front lines, creating desperate improvisations and harrowing choices. Every delay, every misstep, every obstacle that the terrain and weather presented became magnified into a life-or-death problem for the advancing army. Despite these mounting challenges, Hitler remained adamant. Reports of the harsh conditions, of men freezing, of vehicles breaking down were dismissed or downplayed. His orders were clear: continue the advance, seize Moscow, and crush the Soviet Union before the winter could fully arrive. For soldiers and commanders alike, this created a tension between obedience and survival. Pushing forward meant exposure to a growing list of dangers, but hesitation risked the wrath of superiors and the possibility of being labeled a coward or traitor. And so the invasion continued, a staggering experiment in human endurance and mechanical resilience. 3 million men pressed east, fighting not only the Red Army, but the merciless, slow march of autumn toward winter. Snow and ice had not yet fully arrived, but the warning signs were unmistakable. The land, vast and indifferent, already began to dictate the pace of the conflict. Every mile deeper into the Soviet Union extended the supply lines, challenged the soldiers' stamina, and brought them closer to the moment when the cold would strike with deadly efficiency. The German generals understood, perhaps more clearly than Hitler, that their plans were precarious. Yet they could do little but continue. Orders from the high command came down relentlessly. The army must reach Moscow, the heart of the Soviet state, and victory must be achieved before winter could assert itself fully. Yet nature, patient and impartial, was not swayed by strategy, rank, or ambition. Rivers froze and thawed, mud deepened, and as October approached, the first snow would fall, turning the wide fields and endless forests into a frozen trap for the invaders who thought themselves unstoppable. From the vantage of the Soviet defenders, the advance of 3 million men was both terrifying and an opportunity. Retreating units slowed, burned villages behind them, and waited for the inevitable mistakes the Germans would make. Snipers, ski troops, and partisan fighters used the terrain to harry and exhaust the invaders. Every bog, every forested ridge, every icy river became a tool to sap the strength of an army that had come to conquer, not endure. The land itself became a silent ally to the defenders, a force as real as any battalion or artillery battery. And so, Operation Barbarossa moved forward, immense in scale and ambition, yet increasingly vulnerable to the simplest, most merciless of weapons, the environment. Soldiers marched, tanks rolled, and generals planned, but the lessons of Rati Road, of frozen forests, and of Finnish ingenuity loomed ahead. The Rasputitsa was coming, and with it, the first true test of the largest invasion force in human history. As the roads became rivers of mud and the first snows threatened, it was clear that this war would not be won by speed or surprise alone. The cold, the mud, and the sheer scale of the land had begun to fight back, long before frostbite and winter fully set in. The invasion of the East had begun with confidence, precision, and fanfare. Yet beneath it all, the seeds of catastrophe were already sown, waiting for the rain, the thaw, and the frost. The German army marched toward its destiny, unaware that the greatest adversary it would face was not the Red Army alone, but the merciless, indifferent winter of Russia itself, a foe far larger than any human enemy and far less forgiving. As the calendar turned from September into October 1941, the world beneath the German boots began to change. What had once been firm roads and open fields transformed into an expanse of mud so deep and treacherous it seemed alive, sucking at everything that moved across it. The Rasputitsa, the season of mud, was a recurring curse in Eastern Europe, a phenomenon of autumn rains saturating the vast clay and loam of Russian fields, turning highways into rivers of muck and slowing armies to a crawl. For the Wehrmacht, the Rasputitsa was not merely inconvenient, it was catastrophic. Soldiers trudged through quagmires that swallowed their boots, letting water seep into socks and chill flesh to the bone. Vehicles, even the mighty panzer tanks, became trapped, their wheels spinning uselessly in the unyielding clay. Horses struggled, hooves slipping and sinking, collapsing under the strain of pulling artillery pieces. Convoys jammed as trucks became immobile, engines stalling in the sludge, supplies piling up behind the impassable front. The supply lines, already stretched across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, were now paralyzed. Fuel, ammunition, and rations froze in place as effectively as the soldiers themselves would months later. It wasn't just movement that was halted. The entire rhythm of the invasion stuttered. Orders from high command were impossible to execute on schedule. Reinforcements couldn't reach embattled units, and retreating units risked being swallowed by the same mud they sought to escape. Soldiers improvised, laying logs, boards, and whatever timber they could find to create makeshift roads, but the efforts were Sisyphean. Each attempt to move forward was an exercise in frustration, as the land seemed to conspire against them, indifferent to strategy or human planning. The landscape itself became a cruel adversary. Forest paths, usually easy enough for troops on foot, became treacherous channels of sludge. Rivers overflowed into lowlands, turning fields into lakes. Bridges, vital for moving heavy equipment, were washed out or rendered impassable, leaving columns of tanks, artillery, and trucks stranded in the mud. Soldiers fell into these frozen liquid traps, struggling to free themselves while bullets and shells rained from nearby skirmishes. The noise of machinery bogged down, engines groaning and metal clanking mixed with the muffled cries of men, horses, and dying vehicles, an orchestra of despair set to the rhythm of mud and water. For the infantry, the Rasputitsa was an equalizer, if not a tormentor. Foot soldiers slogged through the muck, each step a test of endurance and balance. The waterlogged earth clung to their boots, heavier with every step, dragging their feet down. The cold seeped in through clothing soaked by rain and melting frost, chilling skin and sapping strength. In some places, the mud reached knee-deep or higher, turning long marches into days-long struggles. Equipment was rendered useless, packs grew heavier as wet fabric absorbed rain, and rifles and ammunition could jam under the constant exposure to dirt and water. Men grew exhausted simply from trying to stay upright, and morale began to erode under the unrelenting slog of the landscape. Vehicles fared no better. Trucks that once carried troops and supplies became grotesque metal coffins, their engines buried in the quagmire. Tanks, those symbols of blitzkrieg power, were suddenly slowed to a crawl or left completely immobile. The wide tracks of the Panzer were no match for the sticky, oily clay, and the sheer weight of armored vehicles meant that once they were stuck, pulling them free required extraordinary effort, or abandonment. Fuel and spare parts, already stretched thin, became trapped at the rear, compounding the chaos at the front. Convoys stretched for miles, immobilized, as traffic jams formed in the mud, and men waited helplessly, knowing that every delay could be fatal. The human cost of the Rasputitsa was immediate and profound. Soldiers slipped and fell into the muck, bruised and battered. Foot soldiers developed trench foot long before winter's true bite, a painful affliction caused by prolonged exposure to wet, cold conditions. Hunger, fatigue, and anxiety gnawed at men who had been promised quick victory, leaving many questioning the wisdom of the invasion itself. Even those who were physically uninjured suffered psychological strain, as the land seemed to move and shift against them, trapping them in an alien, hostile world. Meanwhile, the Soviets observed the German struggles with grim satisfaction. While the invading army floundered in mud, Soviet units employed scorched earth tactics. Villages were burned, bridges demolished, and supply depots destroyed, forcing the Wehrmacht to carry its own sustenance and equipment further through an already punishing environment. The Red Army understood the rhythms of the Russian landscape and used it as a force multiplier. Every slowdown, every vehicle swallowed by mud, every exhausted soldier was a tactical advantage, bought by patience and knowledge of the land. The Rasputitsa was merciless, yet strangely poetic in its cruelty. Endless fields of brown water, trees reflected in puddles that stretched for miles, the quiet hum of mud as it sucked at boots and wheels. It was nature's artillery, slow but unrelenting. The sheer monotony of wading through this dying landscape, day after day, crushed spirits. Men would wake before dawn, hope for firm ground, and find only more clay, more water, more exhaustion. The rhythm of life in the invasion became dictated not by enemy fire or strategy, but by the slow, inevitable creep of mud across the roads and fields of Eastern Europe. In some ways, the Rasputitsa foreshadowed the trials to come. Soldiers began to understand that this was not a war they could win with speed alone. Nature had imposed its own schedule, its own constraints. The invaders were learning that the Soviet Union was a vast, living landscape with seasons as weapons. Autumn was not merely a change in weather, it was a test of endurance, of ingenuity, and of sheer stubbornness. The same men who had stormed across France with rapid success now struggled for a single mile, mired in a relentless, sucking earth. Conversations between officers became tinged with frustration and disbelief. Reports of stranded columns, vehicles lost in mud, and troops exhausted to the point of collapse filled the headquarters. Solutions were scarce. Attempts to construct temporary roads, to use planks and logs to traverse the worst areas, offered little relief. Every gain forward was paid for in time, energy, and morale. Letters from the front describe men laughing bitterly at the absurdity of trying to move tanks through what seemed more like a swamp than a battlefield. The environment itself had become the first real adversary of the Wehrmacht, and its lessons were unforgiving. As the weeks of the Rasputitsa dragged on, the mental toll on the soldiers increased. The sight of tanks half submerged in mud, horses floundering, and men sloshing through ankle-deep water became a constant reminder that control was an illusion. Exhaustion wore down discipline. Disease began to spread in wet clothing and soggy camps. Morale fluctuated wildly, buoyed only by the hope that the next day might bring firmer ground, and dashed when dawn revealed more of the same endless mire. Every step forward was a battle, not against men, but against an indifferent, unyielding landscape. By the time the rains began to subside, the stage was set for the true test, the arrival of winter. Soldiers, already weakened and demoralized by the mud, would soon face freezing temperatures, icy winds, and snow that transformed every foot of terrain into a potential trap. The Rasputitsa had been a slow, methodical demonstration of nature's power, exhausting men and machines alike, teaching the harsh lesson that conquest was never simply a matter of tactics, but also of endurance, adaptability, and respect for forces beyond human control. And so as the Wehrmacht staggered through the Russian autumn, trapped and slowed by the mud, the frozen months approached. Soldiers learned quickly that the land could immobilize, isolate, and punish without ever firing a shot. Yet, even as fatigue and frustration mounted, the German advance continued, propelled by orders, ambition, and fear. Ahead lay the frost, the snow, and the winter that would come to define the Eastern Front. The Rasputitsa had passed its judgment, and the armies had learned that the war was far from over, with the real enemy, the merciless cold, waiting just beyond the horizon. As the first snowflakes of winter fell across the vast plains of Russia in late November 1941, a silent enemy descended upon the German forces, an enemy that had no allegiance, no rank, and no mercy. The temperature began its relentless drop, plunging day by day, hour by hour, until the biting cold became omnipresent. The air itself seemed to steal heat from exposed skin, searing cheeks and noses with a white-hot chill, and the rivers, ponds, and marshes froze solid, locking the landscape in a crystalline grip. The men of the Wehrmacht, confident after months of rapid victories, found themselves in a battlefield transformed into an alien, frozen wasteland. The cold arrived like a thief in the night. Soldiers woke to frost-covered blankets, boots frozen stiff, and the icy taste of breath hanging in the air. Every movement required effort. Every step was a calculated exertion, made heavier by layers of wet clothing and the fatigue of weeks spent battling mud, supply shortages, and sporadic resistance. Even the simplest tasks became monumental. Lighting a cigarette required dexterity that numb fingers no longer possessed. Opening a can of rations demanded strength that drained with each frozen breath. Sleep, when it came at all, offered no warmth, for the frost seeped through wool and leather alike, inching into every pocket of insulation, every layer of clothing, until the body itself became a victim. Bread, once a sustaining force, became an instrument of misery. Loaves that had been delivered after weeks of delay were so frozen that men could not slice them with knives. Soldiers were forced to hack at their food with bayonets, axes, or the blunt edge of whatever tools they had on hand. The simple act of eating, normally comforting, became a challenge to both patience and survival. Yet hunger was constant. Rations were insufficient for the energy demands of marching through deep snow, and the cold increased the body's caloric needs beyond what was available. Soldiers gnawed at frozen bread and tinned meats that required considerable effort to open, swallowing hunks of food that scraped throats raw, all while trying to keep their teeth from cracking in the extreme cold. Weapons, the instruments of war, betrayed their users in this environment. Lubricants froze inside rifles, pistols, and machine guns, causing bolts to seize and triggers to jam. Mortars and artillery refused to fire until improvised heat was applied, sometimes with the simple warmth of a soldier's hands, or by setting small fires beneath the mechanisms. Tanks that had survived the mud of the Rasputitsa now shivered uselessly in the snow, their diesel engines thickened by the cold, tracks frozen in place, metal brittle with frost. The very tools meant to protect and advance the soldiers had become liabilities, turning once powerful units into immobile, vulnerable targets. The cold was indiscriminate. Officers and enlisted men alike suffered frostbite, the most common affliction of the campaign. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses would blacken, swell, and sometimes fall away if exposure was prolonged. Medical supplies were limited, and improvised remedies, rubbing with snow, applying alcohol, or simply massaging frozen limbs, offered little relief. Soldiers learned to recognize the first warning signs: a numb tingling in the extremities, pale skin that turned blue, and a creeping pain that refused to be ignored. Ignoring it meant permanent damage or death. Even small missteps like removing gloves to reload a rifle, failing to change wet socks, or marching too long without rest could turn a competent soldier into a casualty before the enemy even fired a shot. The freeze changed the landscape in subtle, terrifying ways. Rivers became solid pathways, tempting soldiers to cross quickly, only to find hidden thin spots where ice broke under weight. Snow-covered minefields, traps and obstacles, turning familiar routes into dangerous unknowns. The crunch of snow underfoot became a haunting soundtrack of war, announcing movements to both friend and foe. And the silence of the frozen forest was deceptive. It was the hush of nature, indifferent to human conflict, amplifying the isolation of every patrol, every soldier trudging through knee-deep drifts. Campsites were no refuge. Tents stiffened with ice, cots became solid platforms that allowed little warmth to seep in, and fires were laborious to light or maintain in damp wood and snow-saturated air. Water sources froze, leaving men desperate for hydration. Streams were covered with thin layers of ice, and boiling snow for water consumed precious fuel and time. Every night, soldiers huddled together for shared warmth, but even in groups the cold infiltrated every corner of clothing and bedding. Dreams, if they came, were haunted by frost, hunger, and the omnipresent threat of death from exposure. Footpaths, roads, and open fields were transformed into treacherous terrain. Marches that should have been simple became a test of endurance as men slipped on ice, fell into snowdrifts, or became disoriented in blizzards. Visibility often dropped to mere feet, and the cold sapped energy faster than bullets could take life. Units became stretched, separated, and lost. Commanders struggled to maintain cohesion, for even the most disciplined troops found it nearly impossible to function under such extremes. Orders became suggestions, and survival instincts often overrode tactics or strategy. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers accustomed to rapid victories and disciplined advances now faced a foe that could not be fought with courage alone. The cold was patient, omnipresent, and unforgiving. Letters from the front tell of despair, of men weeping in silence as they struggled to keep their toes from turning black, of comrades succumbing to hypothermia while the column pressed on. Morale wavered, not because of the enemy's fire, but because every step, every breath, every moment was an unceasing confrontation with the freezing environment. Even basic hygiene became impossible. Feet that remained wet for days developed trench foot and gangrene, often leading to amputations. Clothing and socks frozen solid were difficult to remove or replace. Soldiers became aware of the human body's limits in ways that no textbook could prepare them for. Warmth, once taken for granted, was now the most precious resource, more vital than bullets or rations. Every action, whether cooking a small meal, repairing a weapon, or simply moving forward, was dictated by the battle against frostbite, hypothermia, and exhaustion. The cold also turned enemy encounters into surreal experiences. A skirmish might involve soldiers firing blindly into a white void, rifle bolts stiff and uncooperative, artillery frozen in place. Men trudged through snowdrifts taller than themselves, seeking cover behind snowbanks that offered little protection against bullets, yet provided some insulation from the wind. Tracks of men and vehicles froze instantly, leaving a map of movement that anyone could read hours later. Silence, once a tactical advantage, was shattered by the groaning of frozen wood, cracking ice, and the muted clatter of equipment struggling to function. At night, the mercury plunged even lower. Without the sun's weak winter warmth, temperatures could fall below -30 or 40 degrees Celsius. Soldiers awoke in the darkness, unable to warm themselves, breathing mist that crystallized in the air. Small tasks became monumental, unfreezing a rifle, lighting a fire, or simply moving to relieve oneself outside a tent. Frost covered every surface, and the faintest exposure brought immediate pain. Every man was acutely aware that the cold could kill silently and suddenly, and leaving behind no glory, no fanfare, just the quiet end of life in a frozen wilderness. And yet, amid the brutality, soldiers adapted. Improvised mittens, snow camouflage, and body heat sharing became standard. Ingenious methods to keep weapons operational emerged: heating barrels with fires, oiling mechanisms with alcohol, and wrapping metal in cloth to prevent freezing. Survival became a skill measured not by bravery under fire, but by ingenuity, endurance, and awareness of the environment. Those who adapted lived, those who didn't succumbed quickly. In these frozen months, the war was not just against men, but against the elemental forces of the Eastern Front. Snow and ice became allies to the Soviets and enemies to the Germans, dictating the pace of campaigns and shaping decisions. The landscape became a chessboard of frost and snow, where every advance, every retreat was constrained by the unyielding environment. Leaders could command troops, but they could not command the temperature, the ice, or the snow. These forces were impartial, indifferent, and deadly. The German army learned, often painfully, that the glory of blitzkrieg, rapid, decisive movement, was useless in the face of the freeze. Machines froze, supply lines failed, men suffered. The ice was a relentless instructor, teaching harsh lessons in humility and respect. Every day became a test. Who could keep warm? Who could keep moving? Who could survive long enough to fight another battle? Bread hardened into stone, weapons failed, and frostbite claimed victims silently, invisibly, leaving behind only the cold proof of its presence. And so, as the first true winter deepened over the Eastern Front, the stage was set for the most desperate confrontations yet. The freeze had arrived, unannounced and unrelenting, stripping armies of advantage and forcing men to confront a truth often forgotten in the history of warfare, that sometimes the deadliest enemy wears no uniform, carries no weapon, and makes no sound. It is patience itself embodied in ice and snow, and it waits for no one. The next challenge lay ahead, the siege of Moscow, where men and machines would collide with the frozen heart of the Russian winter. As December deepened, the German forces found themselves teetering on the edge of Moscow, a city that had seemed tantalizingly close just weeks before. Snow swirled across the plains like a white curtain, concealing trenches, obstacles, and the bodies of men who had succumbed to frostbite and exhaustion. The streets of the capital itself were lined with barricades, hastily constructed yet unyielding, as the Soviet population and army prepared for the storm that would not only come from the sky, but from the reinforcements arriving behind them. At the heart of the Soviet response was General Georgy Zhukov, a man whose reputation for unshakable calm and relentless organization would soon become legendary. Zhukov had been quietly gathering forces from Siberia and the Far East, troops who had been promised only minimal engagement elsewhere, freed by intelligence that Japan would not attack the USSR from the east. These Siberian soldiers were accustomed to the cold, masters of survival in frozen landscapes, dressed in thick, quilted uniforms that insulated them from the frigid winds and heavy snow. Their presence alone shifted the balance, a living embodiment of endurance against the elements that had already claimed so many German soldiers. The Germans, meanwhile, were exhausted. The advance on Moscow had stretched supply lines to the breaking point. Fuel, food, and ammunition were increasingly scarce, and the winter had turned roads into impassable ice or snow-choked ruts. Soldiers, once confident in their rapid, decisive tactics, now tramped through snowdrifts taller than themselves, often lost, often isolated. Frostbite and hypothermia were constant threats, claiming more victims than gunfire in many regiments. The men had come to recognize winter not as a season, but as a formidable opponent, its methods cruel, invisible, and unforgiving. For the German High Command, the hope rested on maintaining pressure, on seizing Moscow before the reinforcements could arrive, and the weather worsened further. But the cold had already done its work. Engines refused to start in the sub-zero temperatures, tanks bogged down in snow, and artillery froze, rendering precise targeting nearly impossible. Small unit actions became the standard. Large-scale maneuvers were impossible. Officers barked orders that were often impossible to execute, and the morale of the troops wavered under the combined weight of exhaustion, hunger, and unrelenting frost. In contrast, the Soviets used the snow and cold to their advantage. Trenches were dug, fortified positions strengthened, and camouflage perfected. The Siberian divisions, familiar with the harsh conditions, moved with a speed and stealth that German soldiers could not match. Ski patrols scouted ahead, tracking the enemy and striking with precision before vanishing into the white landscape. The snow was no longer just a hindrance. It became a weapon, an ally, and an element of psychological warfare that broke the confidence of the German advance. The streets and outskirts of Moscow themselves were transformed into defensive works. Sandbags, wooden barricades, and frozen earth created obstacles for any mechanized advance. Civilians contributed by preparing defensive positions, laying anti-tank obstacles, and providing intelligence on German movements. Every structure, every street corner became part of a network of resistance, reinforcing the idea that this city would not fall easily, if at all. The defenders' resolve, combined with Zhukov's strategic genius, turned what had seemed like a fragile line into a fortress of winter ingenuity. The fighting in the snow took on a surreal quality. L soldiers moved like ghosts across frozen fields, leaving footprints that would vanish as quickly as they appeared under new snowfall. Artillery barrages pounded trenches and icy roads, but even the explosions were muffled by snow and frost, a dull thudding rather than the sharp reports of temperate battlefields. Machine guns jammed under the cold, rifles froze, and communication became a logistical nightmare. Orders had to be shouted over the wind, couriers stumbled through the snow with vital messages, and the front lines shifted in a dance dictated as much by weather as by strategy. Amid this chaos, the Siberian reinforcements proved invaluable. They moved swiftly, using techniques learned over years in sub-zero climates, layering clothing efficiently, heating weapons before engagement, and using snow as both concealment and a natural barrier. These soldiers brought a psychological edge as well. German troops, already shaken by frostbite, exhaustion, and the unpredictability of winter, now faced a foe that seemed invulnerable to the cold. Tales of Soviet troops marching with unshakable composure through blizzards, rifles ready, skis gliding silently over frozen ground, spread quickly and demoralized the Wehrmacht even before direct contact. The turning of the tide was also reflected in logistics. While German supply trains sank into icy mud or were abandoned entirely, the Soviets ensured that their lines remained operational. Winterized vehicles, sleds for transporting supplies, and careful pre-positioning of food, fuel, and ammunition meant that Moscow's defenders could sustain the fight indefinitely. Even simple tasks, feeding soldiers, keeping water from freezing, and distributing ammunition, were executed with a precision that contrasted starkly with the haphazard German effort. The cold, once an impartial force, was being mastered by those who understood it, while crushing those who underestimated it. The Germans attempted desperate measures. Ice-choked rivers were crossed with makeshift bridges and pontoons, armored units forced forward despite freezing tracks, and soldiers wore layers of clothing ill-suited to the sub-zero conditions. Yet every effort was met with the uncompromising reality of winter. Frostbite claimed men faster than enemy fire. Snowstorms obscured movement. The terrain itself, seemingly passive, became active in its hostility, channeling soldiers into kill zones and exhausting them before they could engage. The landscape was no longer just a setting. It had become a participant, indifferent yet decisive, reshaping the battle in ways commanders could not control. As December turned to January, the first Soviet counteroffensive began. Zhukov, exploiting intelligence and terrain familiarity, launched a series of coordinated attacks against overstretched German units. Snow and ice amplified the impact. German supply lines were further disrupted. Vehicles that had survived the initial freeze now became liabilities, and soldiers, already pushed to the brink, found themselves surrounded, outmaneuvered, and outlasted. Soviet forces struck in force, cutting off pockets of the Wehrmacht, and the relentless cold compounded the carnage. German troops, frozen and fatigued, were often captured without firing a shot, victims of both man and winter. The psychological toll cannot be overstated. Letters, diaries, and post-war accounts describe the horror of seeing comrades succumbing to frostbite and exhaustion even before meeting the enemy. Frozen limbs, blackened faces, and ice-laden equipment were constant reminders that the front line was not just against the Red Army, but against the elements themselves. Soldiers' morale frayed as they realized that even the bravest acts could be undone by the impartial cruelty of winter. Fear and fatigue became as deadly as bullets, shaping the battlefield as effectively as any strategy or weapon. Yet, amidst the despair, moments of resourcefulness shone through. German soldiers attempted to thaw rifles over small fires, repair frozen engines with ingenuity, and improvise insulation from whatever materials were available. Soviet soldiers, conversely, demonstrated an almost instinctual understanding of winter warfare, maintaining operational effectiveness, moving with speed and precision, and exploiting the enemy's vulnerabilities. The contrast was stark. Preparation and adaptation to the climate became the difference between life and death, victory and defeat. By the end of January 1942, the siege of Moscow had failed for the Germans. The combination of Zhukov's strategic brilliance, the arrival of Siberian reinforcements, and the sheer, unrelenting winter had forced a retreat. German forces withdrew, battered, frozen, and demoralized, leaving behind equipment, vehicles, and men who had fallen to frostbite, exhaustion, or capture. The myth of blitzkrieg invincibility was shattered, and the Wehrmacht faced a sobering reality. Victory in Russia would not be achieved by speed alone, nor by arrogance. Winter was a weapon as lethal as any tank or rifle. The siege of Moscow stands as a vivid example of how the environment can dictate the course of war. The snow, the ice, and the bitter cold were not mere backdrops. They were active participants, shaping tactics, strategy, and human endurance. Soldiers who survived were not just fighters, they were learners in a harsh classroom where frost and storm were teachers as unyielding as any general. And as the German army retreated, the frozen plains, the snow-covered forests, and the icy rivers bore silent witness to the deadly lessons learned in the winter. Of D-1941, a precursor to the mechanized and frozen struggles yet to come, the machines of ice waiting to test men and metal alike. As the winter deepened on the Eastern Front, it became painfully clear that the cold was not just a nuisance, but a relentless adversary capable of turning even the most fearsome war machines into inert monuments of steel. Tanks that had roared across Poland and France now sat frozen, their engines seized and tracks locked in thick layers of ice and snow. Soldiers would pry at the treads with crowbars and pour water over engines in desperate attempts to coax life back into the mechanical beasts, only to watch the fluids freeze almost instantly. The very tools of blitzkrieg, supposedly unstoppable and invincible, were rendered useless by temperatures that plunged well below what any designer had imagined. The German panzer divisions, once a symbol of rapid, mechanized dominance, ground to a halt in the snowbound plains of Russia. Vehicles meant to crush resistance instead became immobile hulks, vulnerable to Soviet artillery and small arms fire. Fuel lines froze, lubricants thickened into gelatinous sludge, and radios went silent. Communication among units broke down not because of enemy interference, but because the batteries themselves would not survive the cold. Commanders, accustomed to coordinating strikes over wide fronts with precise timing, now had to contend with a landscape where time itself seemed to slow and technology betrayed them at every turn. The Wehrmacht's trucks, critical for moving supplies and maintaining the flow of troops, fared no better. Tires hardened and cracked on icy roads, engines refused to start, and the weight of ammunition and food became a burden that vehicles could no longer bear. Soldiers were forced to abandon half-loaded trucks in deep snow, forming long, desperate columns of men, dragging what little they could carry through drifts taller than themselves. It was a grim march of survival, where every step risked frostbite and every breath was stolen by the bitter air. Rifles and machine guns, once reliable extensions of the soldier's will, turned traitorous. Bolt actions froze, springs snapped, and barrels clogged with ice and snow. A well-aimed shot could misfire not because of lack of skill, but because the rifle had become another victim of the merciless winter. Artillery, with its intricate mechanisms and moving parts, ground to a halt or became dangerously unpredictable, each misfire threatening friend and foe alike. Ammunition itself became a liability. Powder dampened by condensation or encased in ice refused to ignite, leaving soldiers staring at empty barrels in the midst of life-and-death encounters. And yet, it was not only the machines that suffered. The soldiers themselves were increasingly intertwined with the failures of technology. Infantry were sent to push tanks stuck in snow, to clear roads for trucks that would never move, and to haul artillery pieces frozen into the earth. The line between man and machine blurred in this frozen theatre. Human energy became part of the effort to animate steel, and yet the humans too were being drained by frostbite, exhaustion, and hunger. Limbs stiffened, faces blackened, and feet turned to ice within boots as soldiers labored to animate what the winter had already claimed. German commanders tried to innovate, desperately attempting solutions that often bordered on the absurd. Fires were built under engines to thaw them, lubricants were heated over open flames, and soldiers would wrap their rifles and vehicles in blankets or straw, hoping for minimal relief. Some tanks were fitted with improvised heaters or insulated with canvas, but these efforts were little more than stopgaps against a foe that knew no compromise. For every mechanical revival there were 10 failures, each one a lesson in the unforgiving laws of nature. Meanwhile, the Soviets, far more attuned to the environment, took advantage of the immobility of German forces. Soviet T-34 tanks, with their wide tracks and robust diesel engines, could traverse snow and ice that trapped German armor. Soldiers dressed in quilted uniforms moved efficiently through drifts, skis gliding silently over the frozen landscape. Mobility and winter knowledge became decisive factors, with cold-hardened men and machines exploiting the paralysis that had seized their invaders. Even when engaging German positions, Soviet engineers often left booby traps in the snow and ice, leveraging the environment itself as an extension of their tactics. The psychological impact of frozen machinery cannot be overstated. Soldiers staring at stalled tanks and motionless trucks felt the weight of futility pressing in. Months of planning, coordination, and relentless march were nullified by the impartial cruelty of winter. Men who prided themselves on discipline and ingenuity found themselves impotent against engines that refused to turn and weapons that would not fire. Fear of the enemy remained, but a new, insidious terror had taken hold. The fear that the cold itself could kill them faster than bullets, that survival depended less on courage and more on the ability to endure ice, snow, and frost that had no mind, no reason, and no mercy. Mechanical failures compounded supply issues. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies could not reach frontline units when trucks were buried in drifts or immobilized by frozen rivers. Field kitchens could not operate, leaving men to eat frozen rations or even raw ingredients scavenged from the wreckage of vehicles. The cold turned routine tasks, starting a vehicle, firing a weapon, even simply keeping warm, into monumental efforts. And as soldiers struggled, commanders faced impossible decisions: press forward with inadequate tools, retreat and risk encirclement, or stand and wait for a thaw that might never come. By late December, entire formations were reduced to skeletal outlines of their original strength. Armored columns became artful arrangements of immobile steel, half buried in snow, while infantry scavenged whatever could be salvaged. Frostbite casualties mounted alongside traditional battle losses. Soldiers described toes turning black, fingers stiffening until they could no longer grip, faces cracked by the wind, and ears bleeding from extreme cold. The cold was as lethal as any sniper, artillery shell, or tank round. It was everywhere at once, a constant companion to death and despair, and it revealed the vulnerability of even the most modern military might. Engineers and mechanics labored around the clock, attempting to breathe life back into frozen machinery. They pried, hammered, poured heated water, and improvised with straw, rags, and oil. Some successes were fleeting. Engines would sputter to life only to freeze again within hours. Soldiers grew increasingly cynical about their machines, speaking of them in hushed tones as if they were cursed, abandoned by both fate and human skill. And yet, these same men pushed onward, trying to make the impossible work, demonstrating a stubbornness that matched the ice in its relentless grip. The human cost of this mechanical paralysis was immense. Each immobilized tank or rifle meant soldiers had to fight harder with what they could carry, often facing superior numbers and better equipped units. Exhaustion combined with frostbite and hunger to erode morale. The German High Command, initially confident that discipline and training could compensate, was forced to confront the terrifying reality that winter could not be reasoned with, negotiated with, or commanded. It could only be endured or succumbed to. The frozen battlefield became a museum of inanimate war. Tanks lined up like tombstones, rifles propped against snowbanks, trucks half buried in drifts, and artillery immobile, as if paying homage to the power of ice. Soldiers moved through this landscape with a mixture of awe, fear, and bitter humor, whispering stories of machines that refused to obey, engines that mocked them, and the cruel lessons of winter that were etched into every frozen surface. The snow, once passive, had become a collaborator in the art of war, exposing the limits of human and mechanical endurance alike. In these months, the interplay between man, machine, and winter revealed fundamental truths about the Eastern Front. Modern warfare, dependent on speed, logistics, and firepower, faltered when the environment became an equal participant. Those who understood winter, its nuances, its dangers, and its tactics, thrived. Those who ignored it, arrogant in past victories and unprepared for the extremes, faltered spectacularly. In the cold, no rank, no strategy, and no weapon could substitute for preparation, endurance, and respect for the merciless laws of nature. As German forces retreated from Moscow, leaving behind their frozen machines, the lessons of machines of ice were indelibly written into the history of the war. The cold had demonstrated its power as both killer and equalizer, a force that could cripple the most sophisticated army in Europe. It was a reminder that in snowy warfare, victory depended not only on the enemy before you, but also on the snow beneath your boots, the ice encasing your engines, and the unyielding frost that would claim the unready without hesitation. The stage was set for another winter, another challenge, and the final icy gambit that would test soldiers once more in the forests and fields of Europe. The Battle of the Bulge. By the late months of 1944, Europe was a continent tired of war but not yet done with it. The Allies had pushed relentlessly from Normandy through France, liberating Paris and pressing toward the German frontier. The German army, though weakened and stretched thin, was still capable of desperate, terrifying maneuvers. Hitler, unwilling to concede defeat, devised a plan as audacious as it was perilous, a final winter gamble that would strike the Allies at their most unsuspecting point, the Ardennes. The Ardennes forest, stretching across Belgium, Luxembourg, and a part of northeastern France, had long been considered a quiet sector of the Western Front. Its dense woods, narrow roads, and steep hills were thought unsuitable for major offensives, and thus it had become a place for newly formed units to gain experience, a place where quiet routine masked the chaos elsewhere. Hitler saw opportunity in that quiet. With the Allies confident and stretched thin, he envisioned a surprise attack that would cut through the American lines, split the Allied forces, and capture the port of Antwerp, an audacious plan to disrupt supply lines and force a negotiated peace. The weather of that winter added a layer of complexity to both sides. A blanket of snow covered the Ardennes. Roads became slick and treacherous, and thick fog grounded the Allied air superiority. Their planes that had decimated German armoured columns in past encounters were stuck on the ground. The cold was biting but not yet deadly, the snow deep enough to slow movement but shallow enough to allow tanks and trucks to pass cautiously. To a German strategist, the snow was both a shield and a sword. It would conceal the advance of troops, mask the noise of engines, and provide cover for movements that might otherwise have been detected. On December 16, 1944, the German offensive began. 250,000 men, supported by tanks, artillery, and mechanized infantry, surged forward with startling speed through the snow-laden forest. The attack achieved total surprise. American units, many composed of inexperienced replacements, were caught completely off guard. Communication lines were disrupted almost immediately, with radios rendered less reliable by the cold and the thick forest interfering with transmissions. German spearheads carved wedges into the Allied lines, creating the bulge from which the battle would take its name. The initial advance was terrifyingly effective. German forces pushed with a mixture of mechanized speed and sheer force, capturing key crossroads and small towns and threatening to unravel the Allied front. American troops were forced to fall back under the relentless pressure, often leaving behind equipment and supplies. The snow, which had initially aided the attackers by concealing movement, also created hazards. Trucks skidded, tanks bogged down, and soldiers slipped into icy streams. Yet the German advance continued, driven by urgency and the audacity of the plan. By December 18th, the Germans had pushed deep into Allied territory, and a critical town became the focal point of resistance, Bastogne. The town sat at the heart of the bulge, where 7 main roads converged, making it a strategic linchpin for both sides. To control Bastogne was to control movement through the Ardennes, and to dictate the flow of the battle. Recognizing its importance, German commanders demanded the town's surrender, confident that their encirclement and superior numbers would intimidate the defenders. The defenders of Bastogne were primarily the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, hastily transported to the area in anticipation of the German advance. They were outnumbered, undersupplied, and exhausted from rapid redeployment through harsh winter conditions. Yet morale remained unexpectedly high, aided by clear leadership and the raw courage of men who understood the stakes. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the division, became an iconic figure during the siege. When presented with the German demand for surrender, he replied with a single, unforgettable word: nuts, a refusal that symbolized defiance against overwhelming odds. The battle that followed was a harrowing test of endurance. Snowfall and freezing temperatures enveloped the battlefield, with the cold biting at soldiers' hands and faces as they dug foxholes in frozen soil. Snow and ice concealed enemy positions, muffled sounds, and made every movement perilous. Paratroopers huddled in dugouts, improvised shelters, and remnants of buildings, trying to stay warm while simultaneously firing on advancing German units. Every day became a struggle not just against enemy fire but against frostbite, hypothermia, and exhaustion. Supplies were desperately needed, yet the frozen, snow-laden roads made resupply difficult. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, all critical for survival and defense, were in short supply. Soldiers ate frozen rations, often nothing more than cold, hard bread, and cans of unheated food. Water froze in canteens and makeshift stoves were quickly consumed by fuel shortages. Every soldier in Bastogne knew that the winter was not a distant threat. It was an active adversary, as deadly as the enemy encircling them. The Germans, meanwhile, faced their own difficulties. Their mechanized units, so effective in prior campaigns, struggled through the snow. Vehicles became stuck in drifts or bogged down in icy roads. Communication lines faltered. Officers rode in trucks that slid unpredictably over frozen terrain, sometimes leaving soldiers stranded without support. While their numerical advantage and initial surprise had given them momentum, winter was already making its presence known. Frostbite and fatigue claimed more men than bullets at times, and the biting cold slowed the rhythm of the offensive. As the siege dragged on, air power began to shift the balance. Initially grounded by the snow and fog, Allied aircraft eventually found windows of opportunity. Fighter bombers and transport planes began to deliver supplies and attack German positions. C-47 transport planes dropped ammunition, food, and medical supplies to the defenders of Bastogne, keeping the besieged paratroopers in the fight. P-47 Thunderbolts and other fighter aircraft targeted German tanks and supply convoys, mitigating some of the initial advantages that surprise had afforded the attackers. The weather, fickle as it was, played a dual role, first aiding the Germans with concealment, then allowing the Allies to regain some operational freedom. The American troops' endurance became legendary. Paratroopers manned their foxholes, repelled German attacks, and coordinated counter-movements despite extreme fatigue and the relentless cold. Night after night, snow muffled the sounds of artillery and small arms fire, but it also allowed German forces to attempt stealthy movements and infiltration. Each day was a brutal calculation: when to fire, when to move, when to conserve strength, and when to endure. The sheer human resilience on display was remarkable, a testament to training, leadership, and the indomitable will to survive against both the enemy and the winter. By December 23rd, the skies began to clear. Allied aircraft returned to the skies, bringing devastating attacks on German positions. The arrival of General George S. Patton's Third Army to relieve Bastogne marked a turning point. Tanks and infantry forged through the snow, breaking the encirclement and linking up with the paratroopers. The German timetable, already disrupted by the tenacity of the defenders and the harsh winter conditions, collapsed entirely. The subsequent days saw a grinding counteroffensive. American and Allied forces pushed the Germans back through the Ardennes, restoring the front line and inflicting heavy casualties. The Battle of the Bulge, ultimately the largest and bloodiest engagement fought by the United States in World War II, had tested the limits of human endurance in extreme winter conditions. Over 500,000 Americans participated, with tens of thousands of casualties. The Germans, despite their initial advantage, had been blunted by a combination of environmental challenges, logistical failures, and the unyielding courage of their opponents. What stands out in this battle is not just the strategy or the tactics, but the sheer interplay between human determination and the cold. The Ardennes, cloaked in snow and shadow, became a crucible where leadership, resilience, and the ability to endure extreme conditions determined outcomes as surely as firepower. The winter had claimed its dues on both sides, yet it was ultimately the preparation, adaptability, and indomitable spirit of the defenders that tipped the balance. The last winter of the European theatre, epitomized by the Battle of the Bulge, remains a haunting reminder of how environment can shape the course of warfare. Snow and ice were as much opponents as the soldiers themselves, and winter's impartial cruelty forced human ingenuity, courage, and endurance to the forefront. This final great winter battle tested men and machines alike, leaving an indelible mark on the history of World War II, and demonstrating that even in the modern age of tanks and planes, nature still commanded respect. From here, the narrative shifts to Bastogne itself, the streets, the foxholes, and the moments of human resilience that defined the heart of the Bulge. It is in Bastogne that the human story, the triumphs, the losses, and the quiet acts of courage becomes vividly personal, setting the stage for our next chapter. The town of Bastogne, in the heart of the Ardennes, was about to become synonymous with endurance, courage, and a bitter, frozen defiance. December 1944 had turned the region into a winter battlefield of stark contrasts. Thick snow blanketing ancient streets, smoke curling from bombed-out buildings, and the constant echo of artillery fire cutting through the silence that snow can sometimes bring. For the men defending Bastogne, every hour was a lesson in suffering, adaptation, and the strange, surreal ways that war and winter intertwined. As the German columns advanced through the Ardennes, the town quickly became the focal point of the Allies' desperate defensive strategy. The 101st Airborne Division, fresh from rapid redeployment, arrived to hold the town, knowing full well that to fail meant the collapse of the entire front in the region. What greeted them was a landscape both familiar and hostile. Streets lined with centuries-old buildings, many now reduced to rubble, blanketed in snow that deepened with each passing night. Trees bent under the weight of frozen limbs, roads turned into slippery channels of ice, and every step carried the threat of both enemy fire and treacherous footing. The human cost of winter warfare was immediate. Soldiers dug foxholes into frozen earth, hands bleeding from the bite of shovels against rock-hard soil. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and ears with merciless precision, often while the soldier remained unaware until the pain became excruciating. It was common for men to find themselves unable to hold rifles or load ammunition, to watch comrades fall to ice as surely as to bullets. The cold became a constant presence, pressing in on every part of life, invading even the smallest moments of rest, curling through blankets that offered little warmth. Food was scarce. Supply lines had been disrupted both by German action and by the snow itself. Paratroopers chewed on frozen rations, sometimes discovering that bread had hardened into an unbreakable stone. Cans of meat became icy blocks, and chocolate turned brittle and impossible to eat without chipping away with knives. Soldiers huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat in narrow foxholes, learning to sleep in shifts to maintain some semblance of alertness while trying to stave off the numbing cold. Every meal, every sip of water was a challenge in survival as much as nutrition. Amid the frost and privation, morale became a fragile yet essential weapon. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe exemplified the defiance necessary to survive. When German officers demanded surrender, the reply of one word, nuts, became both a legend and a lifeline of spirit. The word travelled quickly through the lines, whispered among soldiers crouched in frozen trenches and foxholes, carrying with it the quiet, stubborn determination that refusal could convey. It was a declaration that even in the face of encirclement, extreme cold, and overwhelming enemy forces, the human will could remain unbroken. Combat itself was surreal. Snow muffled the roar of artillery, yet made every movement more visible against the white canvas. Troops advanced cautiously through drifts, slipping and sliding, rifles trembling in frozen hands. Snipers found both advantage and challenge in the snow. Targets left tracks that betrayed their position, yet the bright white landscape reflected light, sometimes making concealment almost impossible. Each engagement was a delicate balance of patience, observation, and endurance, where a single misstep could be fatal. Medical care was rudimentary and overwhelmed. Frostbite and trench foot were rampant, compounded by gunshot wounds and shrapnel injuries. Field medics worked in near-impossible conditions, applying bandages with numb fingers, boiling water to sterilize instruments over small, improvised fires, and moving men to improvise shelters that offered only partial protection from the cold. Sleep was scarce, and the quiet moments, when they came, were filled with the strange, heavy weight of exhaustion that seeped deep into muscle and bone. Despite the misery, the human spirit shone in small acts. Soldiers shared what little food they had, improvised games and songs to pass the hours, and scrawled letters on scraps of paper, hoping the postal system might someday deliver their words. Messages of encouragement were passed along foxholes, sometimes written in snow or chalk, sometimes shouted across the frozen streets. Laughter, rare and brittle, echoed through the night, a fragile rebellion against the pervasive cold and threat of death. Communication with higher command was a lifeline and a source of tension. Radios were unreliable, often failing in the extreme cold, leaving isolated units in the dark about the broader battle. Couriers braved German lines and icy roads to deliver messages, sometimes falling to gunfire or frost, carrying words that could decide the fate of entire companies. Every order, every report carried immense weight, and the men in Bastogne learned to improvise when commands arrived late, or not at all. As the siege continued, the townspeople of Bastogne, caught in the crossfire of history, became part of the tableau. Civilians huddled in damaged buildings, sharing what warmth and food they could, navigating streets layered with snow, ice, and debris. Their endurance mirrored that of the soldiers, and in some ways their presence gave the defenders a renewed sense of purpose, fighting not just for military objectives, but for the people trapped in the freezing, dangerous town. Supply drops eventually became a crucial turning point. Allied aircraft, once grounded by snow and fog, managed to reach the besieged defenders. Parachutes drifted down with ammunition, medical supplies, and rations, landing amidst the snow-drenched streets and foxholes. The soldiers scrambled to recover them, some items partially buried in drifts, others landing awkwardly on rooftops. Each recovered crate was a small victory, a reprieve from the gnawing hunger and the cold that threatened to sap both body and will. The Germans attempted to press their advantage relentlessly. Tank units moved cautiously through the snow, infantry advanced behind them, and artillery pounded defensive positions. Yet every maneuver was slowed by the frozen terrain. Roads that might have facilitated rapid movement became icy traps, impassable without significant effort. Vehicles became immobilized, crews struggled to keep engines running, and supply chains faltered under the relentless winter conditions. The same snow that had initially hidden their approach now betrayed their position, reflecting light and echoing sounds in ways the dense forests and narrow streets could not conceal. For the men in Bastogne, the passage of time became measured not in hours or days, but in frostbite, hunger, and the slow accumulation of fatigue. Sleep was a fleeting, precious commodity, often taken in a half-conscious state, while leaning against frozen walls or piled into makeshift bunks with comrades. Conversations were whispers, laughter a rare spark, and silence punctuated by distant gunfire, the crack of rifles, and the occasional roar of artillery. Despite the relentless pressure, the defenders held. Each repelled attack was a testament to endurance, strategy, and unbroken resolve. And when Patton's Third Army finally arrived, breaking the siege, the relief was tangible. Soldiers who had endured the bitterest of cold, the constant threat of enemy fire, and the gnawing emptiness of hunger felt the fragile, almost unreal relief of support arriving in the snow-covered streets. Bastogne had held, not through sheer numbers or overwhelming firepower, but through human endurance, courage, and the quiet defiance encapsulated in a single, unforgettable word: nuts. The human story of Bastogne is not just one of heroism or strategy. It is a story of how ordinary men endured extraordinary circumstances, of how the cold and the snow shaped every decision, every movement, and every moment of life and death. Hunger, frostbite, fatigue, and fear were constants, but so were courage, ingenuity, and the will to survive. In those snow-filled streets and frozen foxholes, history was written not just in maps and orders, but in the quiet acts of defiance and the resilience of the human spirit. As the snow continued to fall, blanketing the ruins of Bastogne, the men who had endured its winter siege became more than soldiers. They became living symbols of endurance, a testament to what humans can withstand when both nature and the enemy conspire against them. This story, frozen in time and memory, leads naturally to the next reflection on the power of winter itself, where snow and ice did not simply hinder movement, but shaped entire campaigns, buried empires under its weight, and reminded humanity that even the strongest armies bow to the seasons. The snow fell in quiet, relentless layers across the battlefields of Europe, blanketing the scars of war and hiding the countless footprints of men and machines alike. In the aftermath of the Ardennes, the Eastern Front, and the frozen forests of Finland, winter's hand had left an indelible mark, not just on maps and cities, but on the human body, the psyche, and the very way armies moved and fought. To stand amidst these snowy fields was to feel the weight of what had passed, entire divisions immobilized by ice, supply lines choked by snow, and men whose struggles against the cold were as lethal as any combat engagement. Winter had been an uninvited general in every campaign, and its victories had been absolute. Across the Eastern Front, the German Wehrmacht had learned the hard lesson that the Soviet Union was not merely an enemy of men and tanks, but a frozen expanse of rivers, forests, and plains that could swallow armored columns and destroy morale with equal efficiency. The snow and ice transformed familiar landscapes into alien worlds. Roads that had been plowed in preparation for an advance became slick, impassable corridors of mud turned to ice, funneling convoys into predictable paths that were easily ambushed. Rivers froze in deceptive layers, hiding dangerous currents below, and forests became white labyrinths that both shielded and betrayed movements depending on one's knowledge of the land. For the invaders, the environment was no passive backdrop. It was a force that dictated strategy, slowed advances, and punished every miscalculation. In the West, the Ardennes had taught similar lessons. The snow that initially helped the Germans achieve surprise became a trap for movement, a silent enforcer of chaos. Foxholes filled with snow as quickly as they were dug, trenches froze solid, and supplies meant to sustain units were delayed or destroyed by icebound roads. Every man who fought there learned that even small missteps, a frozen wheel, a blocked road, or a misjudged footing, could escalate into fatal consequences. Nature, impartial and indifferent, had shown that even the best planned operations could be rendered fragile when winter chose to intervene. The human toll of these winters was staggering. Frostbite, gangrene, hypothermia, and exhaustion became everyday companions, often taking more lives than bullets. Soldiers huddled in foxholes, sharing body heat and whispers of encouragement, praying not for victory, but for survival through the night. Meals were minimal, often frozen or spoiled, and water had to be melted from snow or ice, each sip a minor triumph over the environment. Morale ebbed and flowed with the weather. Bright days and supply drops brought hope, while blizzards and cold snaps drained men to the bone. In letters home, soldiers described the cold as a living entity, an enemy that mocked them silently, pressing in on every moment of their lives. The snow did more than claim lives. It transformed the rhythm of combat. Artillery shells that could have devastated open fields were absorbed by deep snowbanks. Tanks became immobile hulks frozen in place. Aircraft were grounded for days at a time by blizzards and fog. Even small skirmishes took on a different character, where visibility, footing, and endurance dictated outcomes as much as aim and firepower. A soldier could be technically out of danger from bullets, yet still find himself immobilized and helpless, trapped by ice or snow, at the mercy of weather that demanded respect. Yet even amidst the suffering, winter shaped innovation and adaptability. Soldiers learned to improvise, to use snow for concealment, to recognize signs of approaching blizzards and shifting ice. Skis, snowshoes, and camouflaged uniforms became tools not just of mobility, but of survival. Commanders adjusted tactics to account for frozen rivers, snowdrifts, and frost-ravaged supply lines. Entire campaigns were defined by the seasons, with summer offensives giving way to slow, deliberate winter movements. Winter became a rhythm to which armies had to attune, and those who ignored it paid a terrible price. The psychological impact was profound. Men spoke of the eerie quiet that followed a snowstorm, how it muffled sound yet amplified the sense of isolation. Tracks left in the snow were both a clue and a threat, revealing movements to enemies and marking the passage of fallen comrades. The colorless expanse of snow could lull soldiers into a false sense of calm before the sudden chaos of attack. For commanders, it became a test of patience, judgment, and the ability to see beyond the immediate battlefield, understanding that the snow itself could dictate strategic possibilities and failures. On a larger scale, winter shaped entire nations' perceptions of the war. In Finland, the Winter War had shown that a small, determined population could use cold and snow to achieve disproportionate military effect. In the Soviet Union, the brutal winters reinforced national myths of endurance and resilience, cementing the idea that survival against nature was as important as survival against any enemy. In Germany, the repeated failures against Russian winters undermined morale and shattered the illusion of invincibility that had followed the Blitzkrieg campaigns. Across all sides, winter left lessons etched in memory, tactics, and post-war doctrine. No army could ignore the power of the seasons without paying heavily. Snow also became a silent chronicler of loss. After battles, fields and forests bore the imprint of what had occurred. Frozen bodies, abandoned vehicles, and discarded equipment buried slowly beneath drifting layers. Trenches became icy scars, villages were blanketed into ghost towns, and rivers froze over, holding beneath them a frozen archive of desperate crossings and retreats. The snow preserved in its stillness the traces of human struggle and suffering, offering a quiet testament to the sheer cost of war fought in extreme conditions. Beyond the military, the snow left cultural echoes. Stories, photographs, and memoirs from winter campaigns emphasized the surreal and punishing conditions, the juxtaposition of a serene, white landscape with the horror unfolding within it. The cold became an almost mythic presence, an unseen participant that commanded respect, fear, and sometimes awe. In post-war reflections, historians and veterans alike would point to winter as a decisive factor, a force that shaped outcomes as profoundly as any general or tank division. The snow was impartial, but its effects were decisive. Winter's influence was not solely destructive. It also shaped acts of solidarity and humanity. Soldiers shared limited resources, rescued comrades trapped in snowdrifts, and communicated through improvised signals across icy fields. Civilians who endured sieges, bombings, and occupation often faced the same bitter cold, learning to cope and support one another in ways that transcended military objectives. In the frozen chaos, small acts of cooperation and ingenuity allowed life to persist, even amidst unimaginable hardship. As the war moved toward its conclusion, the memory of winter campaigns remained vivid. The Russian winter had halted one of the largest invasions in history. The Ardennes had tested the limits of human endurance. The forests of Finland had proven that determination could overcome staggering odds. Each snowy battlefield became a lesson in the duality of nature, as beautiful and serene as it was unforgiving and lethal. Soldiers, commanders, and civilians alike carried these lessons forward into peacetime planning, training, and stories shared for generations. By the time spring arrived in 1945, the snow had receded, but its legacy lingered. Battlefields thawed to reveal the remnants of struggle, frozen bodies had been claimed by time or recovered, and towns began to rebuild under muddy, thawing conditions. The environment had tested human limits and reshaped entire campaigns, demonstrating that nature, impartial and unyielding, was an omnipresent factor in human conflict. The winter of WWII had been an equalizer, leveling technological advantages and amplifying human vulnerability. As we look back on these campaigns, it becomes clear that the snow was more than a backdrop. It was a silent participant in every decision, every movement, and every casualty. It demanded respect, punished arrogance, and rewarded ingenuity. The snow that buried empires did so not with malice, but with an impartial rigor that no general could command, no machine could withstand, and no man could fully conquer. This reflection naturally leads us into our final contemplation. The echoes of these winters, the ways in which the frozen battlefields of history continue to inform our understanding of endurance, strategy, and human resilience in the face of the most indifferent of enemies. The snow, now melted in memory but not in impact, leaves its lessons waiting in the quiet spaces between historical records and the frozen imaginations of those who endured it. The snow continues to fall, soft and unrelenting, over fields and forests once scarred by the vast machinery of war. It drapes itself over the memories of men who froze in foxholes, over tanks left immobile in drifts, and over trenches that once held the desperate and the brave alike. It blankets the earth in silence, a quiet curator of history, muting the echoes of gunfire, artillery, and the cries of men in both victory and defeat. Standing in this snow, one senses a stillness that is profound, almost reverent, as if the winter itself remembers the suffering and endurance it witnessed. The snow does not distinguish between victors and vanquished. It falls equally on the remnants of armies, on abandoned weapons, on the simple human debris of battle. Footprints are erased, vehicles are buried, and the landscape becomes a blank canvas once more. The past lingers only in the subtle contours beneath the snow, in the small indentations that hint at the presence of lives and machines that once struggled against both one another and the environment itself. In this quiet, the story of winter warfare is told not through words or monuments, but through the sheer persistence of nature and the soft hush of snow settling on history. There is a paradox in the silence of snow. For those who endured it, winter was never silent. Howling winds, cracking ice, the relentless groan of frozen machinery, the whisper of snow underboots, and the muttered curses of men locked in a battle for survival. Yet, after decades, after the battles have passed, and the dead acclaimed by the thaw or the frost, the silence feels almost contemplative, as if nature itself offers a slow, measured exhalation. It is in this quiet that one can reflect on what winter took and what it left behind, lessons of endurance, ingenuity, and the indomitable will to survive. The snow's gentle covering hides the horrors of war, but it cannot erase their influence. It preserves them in a form that allows reflection rather than repetition. A frozen river might conceal the memory of 1,000 desperate crossings, yet it also serves as a reminder of the fragility of human planning against an indifferent climate. A white forest masks the frantic movement of skirmishes and ambushes, yet it also reveals the extraordinary adaptability of soldiers and civilians who endured inhuman conditions. Each flake that falls in quiet today is a small witness to both suffering and resilience, to the ways in which humans contended with nature's unyielding force. As one imagines standing in these snow-covered landscapes, the enormity of human experience becomes clear. The snow transformed soldiers into ghostly figures, reduced machinery to inert sculptures, and elevated the environment itself into a decisive actor on the battlefield. Winter warfare demanded more than skill with weapons. It required vigilance against frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion. Decisions had to account for temperature, terrain, and the subtle dangers hidden beneath a deceptively uniform surface. Those who underestimated it did not survive, while those who respected its rhythms and limits often did, if barely. Even now, decades later, the echoes of these winters ripple through military thought, strategy, and history. Training for extreme cold, developing cold weather gear, and understanding logistics in frozen environments all stem from lessons learned at terrible cost during these snowy campaigns. The snow that fell in Finland, around Moscow, and through the Ardennes shaped doctrines that persist in armies today. The memory of frostbitten limbs, immobilized tanks, and stalled offensives informs modern planning, ensuring that no general can dismiss the environment without serious consequence. Yet the echoes are not only tactical, they are profoundly human. Letters, diaries, and memoirs preserved the sensation of winter, the sharp sting of icy wind on exposed skin, the aching heaviness of boots frozen to frost-covered ground, the dull roar of artillery muffled by snow, and the quiet camaraderie of men huddled together to preserve heat and hope. In recalling these sensations, one can feel the extraordinary fragility and resilience of life in extremis. The snow that now rests over these fields does more than cover. It teaches, preserves, and mediates between memory and forgetting. There is also a strange beauty in these frozen battlefields. The same snow that threatened life transformed the landscape into surreal stillness. Trees etched with frost, fields shimmering under low winter sunlight, and frozen rivers reflecting the pale sky create scenes that are almost painterly, masking for a moment the brutality that occurred there. This beauty does not diminish the suffering, nor does it romanticize war. Rather, it reminds us that nature's indifference can create moments of wonder, even amidst devastation. The snow's impartiality is a quiet teacher of humility, showing that life and death, struggle and endurance are often governed by forces beyond human control. Time softens the edges of winter's impact. The footprints fade, the frozen trenches collapse, and the ice that once gripped rivers loosens with the thaw. Cities rebuilt, fields replanted, and forests regrown obscure the scars of battle, yet beneath the surface the memory persists. In every snowfall that blankets Europe, the ghost of these winters remains. It lingers in the air of Moscow's outskirts, in Finland's northern forests, in the Ardennes' silent valleys. Each flake falling today is a quiet note in a symphony of endurance, struggle, and the relentless passage of time. For those who study or imagine these campaigns, the snow offers a final, meditative lesson. Victory in war is often measured in territory or casualty counts, yet survival in winter campaigns is measured in much smaller increments. The warmth retained through the night, the ability to melt enough snow for water, the courage to endure another day when frostbite has already claimed toes and fingers. Winter's victories are subtle, personal, and often invisible in grand narratives, yet they shape outcomes as surely as any strategic maneuver. To understand the winter campaigns is to understand the fragile thread on which life and combat balance under extreme conditions. Even as the modern world moves forward with advanced technology, climate-controlled equipment, and rapid deployment capabilities, the lessons of these snowbound winters linger. Training exercises replicate Arctic conditions, cold weather rations are tested rigorously, and militaries study the failures and successes of past campaigns to prevent repetition of avoidable disaster. Yet the fundamental truth remains: no matter how prepared an army, nature retains an independent will. Snow will cover, frost will bite, and the cold will test endurance. This universal lesson echoes across decades, reminding us of the power and impartiality of the environment. In this quiet meditation, it is possible to imagine the snow falling as it did in 1939, 1941, and 1944, tracing the paths of soldiers and machines alike. One can hear the faint crunch of boots, the whisper of skis across frozen terrain, the muffled clatter of mechanized equipment struggling in ice and snow. It is a soundscape of resilience, suffering, and adaptation, filtered through the passage of time. It reminds us that even in silence, history speaks, and that the smallest traces, footprints, tracks, and impressions carry stories of immense human struggle and endurance. And so the snow keeps falling. It covers the battlefield, the foxhole, the frozen river, and the abandoned village. It preserves what it cannot erase and erases what it cannot preserve. It softens the scars of history while amplifying the lessons hidden beneath its surface. Each flake is a silent witness to human courage, folly, endurance, and vulnerability. In its quiet way, the snow narrates the story of winter warfare, a tale of the unseen, relentless force that tested men, machines, and strategies, leaving behind echoes that reach us even now. As you imagine this, perhaps tucked under your own blanket, the warmth contrasting with the cold you cannot feel, there is an intimate connection across time. You are linked to the soldiers who struggled through the same seasons, who faced dangers both visible and invisible, and who learned, sometimes painfully, that survival could be as great a victory as any battle won. In this quiet, meditative snow, history and memory merge, leaving a soft imprint on consciousness. The snow continues to fall. It has covered the traces of men and machines, of victory and defeat, of life and death. It is impartial, serene, and relentless, an eternal participant in the story of human endurance. And in its soft, white embrace, the echoes of icy campaigns remain, reminders of the fragility and resilience of life, the profound lessons of the environment, and the enduring human will to survive even in the harshest of conditions. Here, the story fades, but the snow and the memory it holds remains.